Grace Holloway was dying in a frozen wagon when the mountain man found her. She gave him her last piece of bread, never knowing he was a fugitive hunted for murder. By dawn, he'd vanished, but not far. What he built for her in 7 days would change both their lives forever. But when the law came riding through the snow with guns and warrants, Grace faced an impossible choice. Let him hang for his past or fight for the man who'd given her a future. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The mountain didn't care about justice, and it didn't care about mercy. It only cared about claiming what it could: horses, wagons, hope, and anyone foolish enough to challenge its winter fury. On the 14th day of December 1878, the Colorado Rockies had already swallowed 3 prospectors, a mail coach, and a family of settlers whose names no one would ever learn. Now it was reaching for Grace Holloway, and she was too tired to fight back. The wagon listed at a 30-degree angle, half buried in a snowdrift that had accumulated faster than prayer. Grace sat in the driver's box with her late husband's pocket watch clutched in both hands, the brass cold enough to burn her skin even through her gloves. The crystal face had cracked when the axle split, a spiderweb of fractures that made the frozen hands of time look like they were shattering. 2:15 in the afternoon, it had read when disaster struck. Now, 6 hours later, those same hands mocked her with their stillness, while the real world kept spinning toward a darkness she wouldn't survive. Her horse, a gray mare named Temperance, who'd carried her faithfully from Kansas City, lay dead in the traces. The animal had simply stopped, mid-step, and folded like a paper doll. Grace had screamed, had begged, had even struck the reins against the mare's flank in desperate denial. But Temperance had given everything she had. The cold had taken the rest. Grace had cut the poor creature free from the harness, her hand shaking so badly she'd nearly sliced her own palm open, and then she'd climb back into the wagon because there was nowhere else to go. The wind howled with a voice that sounded almost human, a keening wail that rose and fell like a woman mourning at a graveside. Grace pulled her threadbare shawl tighter and tried to remember what warmth felt like. Her late husband Thomas had a phrase for weather like this: God's own fury. He'd said it with a grin, usually while stoking their fireplace back in their small house in Lawrence. That house was ash now, burned in the raids that had taken Thomas's life 3 months ago. Everything she'd owned had fit into this wagon. Now the wagon was dying too, and Grace along with it. She should have stopped in Denver. She should have waited out the winter, found work, saved money. But the letter in her pocket, the one from her sister Catherine in Sacramento, the one promising a fresh start and a place to heal, had felt like a lifeline she couldn't afford to ignore. Catherine's words had been simple. Come home, Gracie. Come home and let us take care of you. So Grace had loaded her wagon, pointed it west, and told herself that if she just kept moving, the grief couldn't catch her. She'd been wrong about that. Grief had caught her just fine. It sat with her now in the frozen wagon, as present as the cold, whispering that maybe dying here wasn't the worst thing. Maybe it was just the universe correcting her mistake. Thomas was gone. The home they'd built was gone. What was the point of Sacramento, of Catherine's kindness, of another spring she'd have to face alone? Grace opened the pocket watch and looked at the inscription on the inside cover. To Thomas, who makes time stop. Your Grace. She'd given it to him on their first anniversary. He'd carried it through 4 years of marriage and 2 years of territorial violence, keeping it close to his heart even when bullets were flying. It had survived everything, except him. Tears froze on Grace's cheeks before they could fall. Even crying was something this mountain wouldn't allow. The lantern beside her had gone out an hour ago, the oil exhausted. She tried to light it again with numb fingers and failed. The matches were damp, her hands were shaking, and the wind kept blowing out every flame before it could catch. So she sat in darkness, listening to the storm try to tear her wagon apart board by board, and waited for the end. She wondered if it would hurt, freezing to death. She'd heard it was peaceful, like falling asleep. She hoped that was true. Somewhere in the howling darkness, a voice called out. At first, Grace thought she'd imagined it, a trick of the wind, or her mind beginning to slip away. But then it came again, rough and urgent, cutting through the storm. Anyone alive in there? Grace's head snapped up. Her heart, which had been beating slow and resigned, suddenly hammered against her ribs. Here! She tried to shout, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat too cold to work properly. She swallowed, tasted blood where her lips had cracked, and tried again. "I'm here. Help me." The voice came closer. "Keep talking. I'll find you." "Here." Grace banged her fist against the wagon's side panel, the sound muffled by snow. "Please, I'm in the wagon." A shadow moved through the white chaos, tall, broad-shouldered, struggling against wind that would have knocked a smaller man flat. Grace watched through the cracked canvas as the figure approached, and for a moment, pure animal terror seized her. She was alone, miles from any town, and a stranger was coming through a blizzard that should have killed him. What kind of man survived weather like this? What did he want? But then the figure reached the wagon, and Grace saw his face in the dim light of the storm, weathered and frost-rimmed, with ice in his beard and exhaustion carved into every line. And she saw something in his eyes that made the fear drain away. He looked as desperate as she felt. He looked like he was trying to outrun something worse than weather. "Ma'am." His voice was a low rasp, probably from shouting over the wind. "Are you hurt?" Grace's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. "My horse, dead. Axle broke. I can't." "I understand." He glanced at the wagon's angle, at the dead mare in the snow, at the wreckage of her supplies scattered by the storm. His face hardened with something that might have been recognition. "You have shelter here." The wagon, but no fire, no oil. The man looked back the way he'd come, as if weighing options Grace couldn't see. Snow had already accumulated on his shoulders, white on the dark wool of his coat. He was carrying a rifle, she noticed, an old army carbine, and a pack that looked like it had been through a war. When he turned back to her, his jaw was set. "I have nothing to offer but body heat and another coat. But if you'll have me, I'll stay. 2 people survive better than 1. Grace knew she should be cautious. Every story she'd ever heard told women not to trust strange men, especially not in isolated places where no one could hear you scream. But those stories assumed you had something left to lose. Grace was dying. This man was offering her a chance not to die alone. "Come in," she said. He climbed into the wagon with surprising grace for such a large man, settling into the space beside her with careful distance, as if aware of the presumption his presence created. Up close, Grace could see he was younger than his weathered face suggested. Maybe 35, with gray already threading through dark hair. His eyes were blue, or had been once. Now they looked like winter itself, pale and cold and vast. "My name's Luke," he said, shrugging out of his heavy coat. "Luke Mercer." "Grace Holloway." She tried to wave away the coat. "You'll freeze." "I've been freezing for 8 years, ma'am. One more night won't kill me." He draped the coat over her shoulders before she could protest further. The wool still held his body heat, and Grace nearly sobbed at the sudden warmth. "You have any food?" Grace fumbled in her bag and found what she had left, a heel of bread, hard as a brick, and a small cloth bundle of dried apple. She'd been rationing it, trying to make it last the journey. Now it seemed foolish, hoarding food she'd never lived to eat. "Here." Luke stared at the meager offering, then at her. "That's all you have?" "It's enough to share." Something shifted in his expression, surprise or maybe pain. He took the bread and broke it carefully in half, then did the same with the apple. "You're too kind for this territory, Mrs. Holloway." "It's just grace, and kindness doesn't cost extra." "It should." Luke bit into his portion of bread and chewed slowly, making it last. World would be fair if kindness had a price, then maybe more people could afford it. They sat in silence for a while, eating their shared meal while the storm raged outside. Grace found herself studying him in sideways glances, the way his hands shook slightly as he ate, the way he kept his rifle within reach, the way his eyes never quite settled on anything. He looked like a man who'd forgotten how to be still, like he was always waiting for something to find him. "What brings you out in weather like this?" Grace asked eventually. Luke was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Running from a choice I made a long time ago." "Bad choice?" "The worst kind. The kind you'd make again if you had to." He met her eyes, and Grace saw something raw in his gaze. Old grief, old rage, old guilt all tangled together. "What about you?" Women don't usually travel these mountains alone in winter. I'm not running. I'm trying to get to my sister in Sacramento. She's all I have left. Husband? Dead, 3 months ago. Luke nodded slowly, and Grace realized he'd already known, had seen the black dress under her coat, the way she held that pocket watch like a talisman. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, Grace. What about you? Are you married? The question hit him like a physical blow. Grace saw it in the way his jaw clenched, the way he looked away toward the wagon's torn canvas. Long time ago, my wife and daughter froze to death in a wagon not unlike this one. 7 winters passed. Grace's breath caught. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have. No. Luke's voice was rough but steady. You should know. You should know why I stopped when I heard you calling. Why I'm sitting here instead of. He trailed off, shook his head. There was a blizzard, worse than this. Their wagon broke down. I was 2 days behind them, following their trail. By the time I found them, it was too late. Sarah had wrapped our daughter Lily in every blanket we owned, held her close, tried to keep her warm. But the cold doesn't negotiate. It takes what it wants. Grace felt tears burning in her eyes again. You couldn't have known. I should have been there. Luke's hands curled into fists on his knees. I should have been with them. Instead, I was drinking in some mountain town, celebrating a hunting bounty with men whose names I don't even remember. I got the news 2 days late. 2 days. If I'd left when I should have, if I'd been sober, if I'd just... He stopped, jaw working. 8 years, and I still can't finish that sentence. 8 years, and I'm still trying to make up for those 2 days. Is that why you stopped for me? Grace asked softly. Because of them? A woman froze to death once because of me. Because I wasn't there. Because I chose wrong. Luke looked at her, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. I won't let it happen again. Not while I'm breathing. Not while I have a choice. Grace didn't know what to say to that. How did you comfort a man carrying 8 years of grief? How did you tell him that some debts couldn't be repaid, some choices couldn't be unmade? So she didn't try. Instead, she did something simpler. She reached out and took his hand. Luke stiffened, as if the touch shocked him. His hand was rough with calluses, cold despite the shared body heat, and it trembled slightly in hers. But he didn't pull away. Thank you, Grace said, for stopping, for staying, for giving me your coat and half your hope. Thank you for choosing to be here. Luke's throat worked. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally managed, You gave me shelter. You gave me your last piece of bread. You treated me like a human being instead of... He stopped himself. Instead of what I probably look like. Thank you for that. What do you look like? A ghost. A wanted man. A killer. He said it flatly, watching for her reaction. Pick one. They're all true. Grace should have been afraid. A wanted man. A killer. Those words should have sent her scrambling for the wagon's far side, should have made her scream for help that wouldn't come. But the hand in hers wasn't the hand of a monster. It was the hand of someone who'd lost everything, just like she had. Someone who'd been running for so long, he'd forgotten how to stop. I don't care what you look like, Grace said. Right now, you look like the man who saved my life. Luke closed his eyes, and his hand tightened on hers. You shouldn't trust me. You don't know what I've done. And you don't know what I've survived. Maybe we're even. A sound escaped him, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Fair enough, Mrs. Holloway. Grace. Grace. He said her name like he was testing it out, seeing if he remembered how to speak with gentleness. You should try to sleep. I'll keep watch. Watch for what? Trouble. It has a habit of finding me. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that watching wouldn't help if the cold decided to claim them both. But exhaustion was pulling at her bones, and Luke's coat was warm, and his presence beside her felt like the first safe thing she'd encountered in months. So she let her eyes close, her head tipping sideways until it rested on his shoulder. I'm sorry, she mumbled. So tired. It's all right. Luke's voice was soft, almost tender. Sleep, I've got you. And impossibly, with a storm trying to tear the world apart and a stranger's confession of murder still echoing in her ears, Grace Holloway slept. Luke didn't sleep. He sat in the frozen wagon with a widow's head on his shoulder and his sins sitting heavy on his chest, and he kept watch the way he'd failed to do 8 years ago. The wind screamed, the canvas tore, snow found its way through every crack and gap, dusting them both with white. But Luke stayed awake, stayed vigilant, because this time, this one damn time, he was going to be there when it mattered. Grace's breathing was shallow but steady against his shoulder. She murmured in her sleep, fragments of words Luke couldn't quite catch, names maybe, or prayers. Her hand was still tangled with his, her fingers long and fine-boned, a lady's hands despite the calluses grief had given her. She smelled like wood smoke and lavender soap, human scents that Luke had almost forgotten existed in the world. He'd been alone in the mountains for so long that the simple presence of another person felt almost alien. He studied her face in the dim light, young, maybe 25, with fine features that hardship had sharpened but not broken. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back in a braid that had come half undone during her ordeal. There was a strength in her face, Luke thought, a steel spine wrapped in kind flesh. She'd looked him in the eye when he'd told her he was a killer, and she hadn't flinched. That took courage. More courage than most people possessed. The pocket watch lay in her lap, still clutched in her free hand. Luke could see the inscription when she shifted. To Thomas, who makes time stop. He wondered what kind of man Thomas Holloway had been. Good, probably. The kind who deserved a woman like Grace. The kind who'd never have let her travel these mountains alone. Not in winter. Not while there was breath in his body. The kind of man Luke used to be, before everything fell apart. Luke's thoughts drifted. Dangerous territory, but the night was long and the storm gave him nothing else to do. He thought about Sarah, who'd had hair the color of wheat fields, and a laugh that could break through his darkest moods. He thought about Lily, who'd been 5 years old and obsessed with collecting rocks, whose small hand had fit perfectly in his. They'd been planning to move to Oregon, start a farm, build a life that didn't involve hunting and trapping and blood. Then Luke had taken that bounty, had stayed too long in that town, had made the choice that killed them. He thought about Captain Luke Mercer, the man he'd been before he became a ghost. That man had worn a Union uniform, had believed in duty and honor, had led cavalry charges with his head held high. Then he'd discovered what Major William Brennan was doing, selling army rifles to hostile tribes, pocketing the money, covering it up with falsified reports. And Luke had made another choice. He'd confronted Brennan. They'd fought. Brennan had drawn his pistol. Luke had been faster. The army didn't see it as self-defense. They saw it as a captain murdering his superior officer. They'd put him in irons, scheduled a court-martial, promised him the rope. So Luke had done what any cornered animal would do. He'd run. He'd escaped during a prisoner transfer, disappeared into these mountains, and let the world believe Captain Luke Mercer had died out here somewhere. In a way, he had. Sarah and Lily had been waiting for him in a town called Evergreen, expecting him to arrive with money from his last hunting job. Instead, he'd arrived 2 days too late to save them. He'd found their wagon in a ravine, the two of them frozen in each other's arms. The love of his life and his whole future turned to ice because he hadn't been there. Luke had built their graves with his bare hands. Then he'd walked deeper into the mountains, hoping something would kill him. Nothing had. The storm began to weaken around 3 in the morning. Luke felt it in the way the wind's howl dropped to a moan, the way the snow stopped battering the wagon like fists. By 4, gaps appeared in the clouds, and starlight filtered through. By 5, the blizzard had passed completely, leaving behind a world transformed, white and still and deadly beautiful. Luke eased his shoulder out from under Grace's head, moving with the care of a man defusing a bomb. She stirred but didn't wake, her breath misting in the freezing air. Luke laid her down gently on the wagon's floor, covered her with both coats, his and hers, and then climbed out into the dawn. The cold hit him like a fist, stealing his breath. His joints screamed protest after a night of sitting still, but Luke ignored them. He'd survived worse. He looked around at the devastation the storm had left behind. Grace's supplies scattered and half-buried, her dead horse already attracting crows, her wagon listing like a drunk against the snowdrift. She had nothing. No transport, no shelter, no hope of making it to Sacramento before spring. But Luke looked at the clearing where the wagon sat, and he saw something else. He saw level ground. He saw timber, plenty of it, tall lodgepole pines that would cut straight and true. He saw a creek, frozen now but reliable once the thaw came. He saw everything you'd need to build a cabin, everything you'd need to give someone a chance. Luke retrieved his axe from his pack. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, the blade nicked but sharp. He walked to the nearest tree, measured its trunk with his eyes, and began to chop. The sound rang out across the frozen landscape, sharp, rhythmic, inexorable, a promise being kept, one strike at a time. Tis. Grace woke to silence. After the storm's fury, the quiet felt unnatural, oppressive, like the world had died in the night. She sat up, confused by the weight of the coats covering her, confused by the empty space where Luke had been sitting. Then she heard it. The distant, steady rhythm of an axe meeting wood. She climbed out of the wagon, her muscles protesting every movement. The cold snatched at her breath, but the sky was clear, achingly blue, studded with morning stars that were just beginning to fade. Dawn light painted the snowdrifts pink and gold. It would have been beautiful if it weren't so deadly. Grace followed the sound of the axe to a clearing 30 yards from the wagon. Luke was there, coat off despite the cold, swinging the axe with mechanical precision. A tree lay on the ground beside him, already limbed. Another stood marked with chalk. And he was working on a third, the axe blade biting deep into the trunk with every stroke. "What are you doing?" Grace called out, her voice rough from sleep. Luke paused mid-swing, lowered the axe, and turned to face her. Sweat steamed on his forehead despite the temperature. His breath came in white clouds. "Building you a cabin." Grace stared at him. "What?" "You can't travel. Your wagon's broken. Your horse is dead. And even if you could walk, you'd freeze before you made it 10 miles. Luke gestured at the felled tree, at the timber around them. "But there's everything here you need to survive the winter. Good timber, water, shelter. So I'm building you a cabin. I can't pay you." "I don't want payment." Luke's voice was flat, final. "You gave me shelter when you didn't have to. You gave me your last piece of bread. You treated me like a person when you had every reason not to." He looked at her with those winter-pale eyes. "You reminded me what it felt like to be human. Let me do the same." Grace opened her mouth to protest, but something in his expression stopped her. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. This was something else, something raw and desperate, a man trying to balance scales that would never balance. She thought about what he'd told her in the wagon, about his wife and daughter, about being 2 days too late. "Luke," she said softly, "you don't owe me this." "Maybe not." He picked up the axe again. "But I owe it to someone. Let it be you." He swung the axe and the tree shuddered. Grace watched him work, watched the way his shoulders moved, the way his hands gripped the axe handle like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to earth. This was a man, she realized, who needed to build this cabin, who needed to save someone, even if it couldn't be the ones he'd lost. "Then let me help," Grace said. Luke paused again, frowning at her. "You should rest. You almost died last night." "So did you, but you're not resting." Grace walked toward him, her boots crunching in the snow. "If you're building me a cabin, the least I can do is learn how it's done. Teach me." For a long moment, Luke just looked at her. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but close, a crack in the ice. "All right, Mrs. Holloway, let's build you a home." The work was brutal. Grace had never done manual labor like this. Her life in Lawrence had been a life of sewing and cooking and tending house. Woman's work that left your fingers sore, but your back intact. This was different. This was hauling logs that weighed more than she did, stripping bark until her palms blistered and bled, learning to swing an axe with a rhythm that made her shoulders scream. By noon of the first day, Grace wanted to quit. By evening, she wanted to cry. But she didn't do either, because Luke never stopped. He worked like a man possessed, like the devil himself was timing him, and Grace refused to be the weak link. Luke taught her with surprising patience. He showed her how to notch logs so they'd fit together tight, how to strip bark without gouging the wood underneath, how to split shakes for the roof. He spoke in short, clipped sentences. Like this, and watch the angle. And good, that's better. But every instruction was clear, every demonstration precise. He'd built before, Grace realized. Many times, probably. This wasn't a man learning as he went. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. They fell into a rhythm. Luke would fell the trees, limb them, cut them to length. Grace would strip bark and drag the smaller logs into position. Together they would hoist the wall logs into place, fitting them into notches Luke had cut with an artist's precision. The cabin rose slowly, inches at a time, then feet, the walls climbing toward the sky like something inevitable. On the second night, they sat by a fire Luke had built outside the half-finished cabin. Grace's hands were wrapped in strips of cloth torn from her spare dress, her palms too raw to leave bare. She was exhausted in a way she'd never been before, muscle deep, bone deep, the kind of tired that made you question everything. "Why did you really stop?" Grace asked, staring into the flames. "Last night, in the storm. What made you turn back?" Luke was quiet for a while, whittling a piece of kindling into nothing. "I heard your voice," he said eventually, "calling for help, and for just a second it sounded like Sarah, like my wife." He looked up at Grace, his face shadowed by firelight. "I knew it wasn't her, knew she was 8 years gone, but I turned back anyway because maybe, just maybe, this time I could be there. This time I could save someone." Grace felt her throat tighten. "Do you always do this? Build cabins for strangers?" "No, you're the first stranger I've talked to in 3 years." Luke tossed the whittled stick into the fire. "Mostly I avoid people. People ask questions. Questions lead to answers. Answers lead to nooses. You really think they'd hang you for killing that officer?" "I know they would. The Army doesn't forgive desertion, and they sure as hell don't forgive murder." Luke's jaw tightened. Brennan had friends. Powerful friends. Men who'd rather see the truth buried than admit one of their own was dirty. My court-martial was scheduled before I even got a lawyer. They weren't looking for justice. They were looking for a scapegoat. But if you explained what he was doing, who'd believe me? A captain's word against a major's posthumous reputation? With no evidence, no witnesses, just my story? Luke shook his head. I'd swing, and Brennan's ghost would go right on being a hero. That's how it works, Grace. The guilty get mourned. The innocent get graves. Grace watched him across the fire. This man who'd saved her life and then stayed to build her a future. What was she like? Your wife? Luke's expression softened, just a fraction. Sarah? She was steady, like bedrock. I was the one who'd rage and storm, and she'd just look at me with these calm brown eyes and say, "You done yet, Luke?" Then she'd hand me a cup of coffee and wait for me to settle. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. She could have married better. Should have, probably. But she chose me, God knows why. And your daughter? Lily. Luke's voice cracked on the name. 5 years old, obsessed with rocks. She'd collect them everywhere we went, shiny ones, rough ones, funny-shaped ones. Used to line them up by the fireplace like they were soldiers. He looked down at his hands. I used to tell her stories at bedtime, made up things about brave knights and dragons. She'd fall asleep halfway through, but I'd finish the story anyway, just in case she was listening. She knew you loved her. Did she? Luke's voice was raw. When she was dying in that wagon, freezing to death because her father wasn't there, did she know? Or did she think I'd abandoned her? Luke, Sarah wrapped her in every blanket we owned, held her close, tried to keep her warm, but it wasn't enough. The cold doesn't care how hard you try. Luke stood abruptly, his movements jerky. I found them 2 days later. 2 days. I was so close. If I just... He stopped himself, jaw working. I'm going to check the perimeter. Get some sleep, Grace. He walked into the darkness before Grace could respond, disappearing into the trees like a ghost. Grace sat by the fire alone, listening to the night sounds of the forest, and wondered if Luke Mercer would ever forgive himself for being human. By the third day, the cabin walls stood shoulder high. Grace's hands were a mess of blisters and calluses. Her back ached with every breath, but she kept working. There was something deeply satisfying about it, seeing the tangible results of labor, watching shelter emerge from raw timber. This was something she was building, something she could control, in a world that had taken control away from her. Luke worked beside her, steady and tireless. They didn't talk much during the day. The work demanded too much focus. But in the evenings, by the fire, they began to share the stories that made them who they were. Grace told him about Thomas, about their quiet life in Lawrence, about the raiders who'd burned it all down. Luke told her about his years in the army, about leading cavalry charges, about the weight of command, and slowly, carefully, they began to trust each other. On the fourth evening, Grace slipped on a patch of ice while carrying water from the creek. She went down hard, the bucket flying, her ankle twisting beneath her. She cried out more in frustration than pain, another delay, another setback, and tried to push herself up. Luke was there in seconds, dropping his axe and running. He caught her before she could stand, his hands gentle but firm on her arms. "Don't move. Let me look." "I'm fine," Grace insisted, even as pain shot up her leg. "It's just twisted." "It's swelling already." Luke's hands moved to her ankle with surprising care, probing gently. "Not broken, but you need to stay off it. Come on." He lifted her before she could protest, one arm under her knees, one behind her back, and carried her toward the half-finished cabin. Grace's breath caught, not from pain but from the sudden closeness, the strength in his arms, the way he held her like she weighed nothing at all. "Luke, I can walk." "Not on that ankle, you can't." He set her down gently on a log inside the cabin, then began unlacing her boot with careful fingers. "This is going to hurt." It did. Grace hissed as he eased the boot off, revealing an ankle already turning purple. Luke examined it with the focused attention of a field medic, then stood and retrieved his pack. He came back with a strip of cloth and a small tin of something that smelled like pine resin and herbs. "What is that?" "Salve. Learned it from a Ute medicine woman years back. Helps with swelling." Luke spread the salve on her ankle with gentle fingers, then wrapped it firmly with the cloth. "You're lucky. Could have been much worse." Grace looked down at his bowed head, at the way his hands, so capable of violence, she knew, moved with such care. "Thank you." "You don't need to thank me every time I do something decent, Grace." But his voice was soft, almost amused. "I'm starting to think you have low standards." "Maybe. Or maybe I just recognize kindness when I see it." Luke finished wrapping her ankle and sat back on his heels, looking up at her. They were close, closer than they'd been since that first night in the wagon. Grace could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his beard didn't quite hide the vulnerability in his expression. For a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them felt charged, electric, like the air before a lightning strike. Then Luke cleared his throat and stood. "You should rest. I'll finish up today's work." "Luke, rest, Grace." His voice was firmer now, controlled. "That's an order." He left before she could argue, returning to his axe and his timber and his relentless rhythm. Grace watched him through the cabin's unfinished doorway, her ankle throbbing, her heart beating strangely fast. Something had shifted between them in those few seconds, something neither of them knew how to name. That night, Luke built the fire closer to the cabin so Grace wouldn't have to walk far. They ate in comfortable silence, rabbit he'd trapped, cooked over the flames, and then sat watching the stars emerge. The night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that made the stars look close enough to touch. "Tell me about California," Luke said suddenly. "About your sister. What's waiting for you there?" Grace smiled, thinking of Catherine. "She's 2 years older than me, married a man who owns a mercantile in Sacramento. They have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Catherine's letters are always full of stories about them, about the chaos and the joy." Her smile faded a bit. "She says there's room for me. A job in the store if I want it. A place to heal." "Sounds good." "It does, but I wonder sometimes if I'm just running, if I'm trying to bury Thomas instead of grieve him." Grace looked at Luke. "Is that what you're doing out here, burying Sarah and Lily?" Luke was quiet for a long time. "I'm not sure I know how to do anything else." "You're building me a cabin. That's something." "It's timber and nails, Grace. It's not redemption." "Maybe not. But it's a start." Grace leaned back against the cabin wall, careful of her ankle. "Do you ever think about going back? Facing what you ran from?" "Every day." Luke's voice was barely audible. "Every day I think about turning around, walking back into civilization, finding a lawyer, fighting for my name. And every day I remember that the army has 5 years on me, 5 years of calling me a deserter and a murderer, 5 years of making me the villain. My truth died the day I ran, Grace. No lawyer in the world can resurrect it. But you're tired of running. It wasn't a question, and Luke didn't treat it like one. So tired I can't remember what standing still felt like. Grace reached out and took his hand, the same way she had that first night in the wagon. Luke's fingers closed around hers, trembling slightly. Then maybe it's time to stop, she said softly. Maybe it's time to face whatever comes and see if you're still standing when the dust settles. You don't know what you're asking. I'm not asking anything. I'm just saying, Grace squeezed his hand. I'm saying you saved me. You're building me a home. You're giving me a future. Maybe someone should do the same for you. Luke looked at her, and in his eyes Grace saw 8 years of grief, 8 years of guilt, 8 years of running finally colliding with the faint, fragile possibility of hope. And if I end up swinging from a rope? Then at least you'll die knowing you tried, that you didn't spend the rest of your life hiding. Grace met his gaze steadily. That you were brave enough to be seen. Luke's throat worked. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally managed, You're dangerous, Grace Holloway. You make a man think he deserves things he doesn't. Maybe you deserve more than you think. They sat like that, hands clasped until the fire burned low and the cold drove them toward sleep. Luke helped Grace into the cabin where he'd laid out both their bedrolls side by side for warmth. They settled in with careful distance between them, but Grace fell asleep with the memory of his hands on her ankle, his arms around her, his voice saying her name like a prayer. And Luke lay awake beside her, staring at the stars through the unfinished roof, wondering if maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible after all. The 5th day dawned clear and cold. Grace's ankle was better, the swelling reduced enough that she could hobble around without too much pain. Luke had started work on the roof, laying cross beams and preparing to split shakes, when he suddenly stopped mid-swing and looked north. What is it? Grace asked from where she was sorting kindling. Riders. Luke's voice was flat, controlled. 3 of them, coming fast. Grace's heart sank. She followed his gaze and saw them. 3 figures on horseback, emerging from the tree line about a mile away. Even at this distance, the morning sun glinted off something metallic. A badge, maybe. Or a gun. Luke set down his axe very carefully. His hand moved to the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. Grace, listen to me. Whatever happens, whatever they say, you don't know me. I'm just a trapper who helped you survive the storm, that's all. Luke, please, his voice cracked. I can handle whatever comes, but I need to know you're safe. Promise me you'll say you don't know me? Grace wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she wouldn't lie, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This was a man preparing to face his reckoning and trying to protect her from the fallout. I promise, she whispered. The riders drew closer. Grace could see them clearly now, 3 men, 2 in ordinary trail clothes and 1 wearing a sheriff's star. The one with the badge was older, maybe 50, with a gray beard and the hard eyes of someone who'd seen too much violence. He reined in his horse 20 feet from the cabin, his companions flanking him, and studied Luke with the kind of recognition that made Grace's stomach drop. Captain Luke Mercer, the sheriff said. His voice was gravelly, tired. Been a long time. Luke's hand stayed near his rifle, but he didn't reach for it. Sheriff Vickery, still wearing the badge, I see. Still doing the job. Vickery's gaze flicked to Grace, back to Luke. Want to tell me what you're doing out here? Building cabins? Playing carpenter? Helping a woman who nearly died in the blizzard. Luke's voice was steady, but Grace could see the tension in his shoulders. That a crime now? Depends on the woman. Depends on the help. Vickery shifted in his saddle. We got word a few weeks back. Army's looking for you. Been looking for you for 8 years, matter of fact. Seems they want to finish what you started. They want to hang me for killing a corrupt officer who drew first. That your story? That's the truth. Vickery studied Luke for a long moment. You know I have to take you in. You know I got a warrant here with your name on it. I know. Luke took a slow breath, and Grace saw something shift in him, a kind of resignation, or maybe relief. But before you do, I have a question. Are you here because you think I'm guilty? Or because someone told you to find me? Does it matter? It might. To me, anyway. Luke's gaze was steady on the sheriff. Because if you're here for justice, that's one thing. But if you're here because someone wants me silenced, that's different. Vickery's jaw tightened. I don't work for the army, Mercer. I work for the law. And the law says you deserted and you killed a superior officer. The law also says a man has the right to defend himself. Then you should have stayed and proved it. Instead you ran, and running makes you look guilty. Vickery gestured to his companions. I'm taking you back to Carson Ridge. There'll be a proper trial this time. Fair hearing. Whatever comes of it, comes of it. Luke nodded slowly. He looked at Grace, and she saw everything in his eyes. Regret, apology, a strange kind of peace. I'm sorry, he said quietly. The cabin's almost done. Another 2 days and it'll be weatherproof. There's enough firewood stacked to last you the winter, and the creek will thaw in spring. You'll be all right. Don't, Grace's voice broke. Don't talk like you're saying goodbye. I might be. No. Grace stepped forward, ignoring the protest from her ankle. Sheriff, wait. You can't just take him. He saved my life. He spent 5 days building me shelter when he didn't have to. That's not the action of a murderer. Ma'am, I appreciate what he did for you. Then let him finish. Let him finish the cabin. Give us 2 more days and then you can take him wherever you need to. Grace met Vickery's eyes. Please, he deserves that much. Vickery looked between them, his expression unreadable. You know him? Before the storm, I mean? No, but I know him now. Grace's voice was steady. I know he's a man who keeps his word, who works until his hands bleed, who told me about his wife and daughter and how much their deaths still haunt him. She looked at Luke. I know he's trying to be better than his worst moment. Isn't that what the law is supposed to allow? The sheriff was quiet for a long time. Finally, he sighed and dismounted. 2 days. We'll camp nearby, make sure he doesn't run. But 2 days, Mercer, and then you're coming back to face this. Understand? Luke's eyes widened slightly. You're giving me time to finish? I'm giving you time to keep your word to this woman. Don't make me regret it. Vickery looked at Grace. Ma'am, is there anything you need? You sure you're safe here with him? I've never been safer. Grace's voice was firm. I'd trust him with my life. I already have. Vickery nodded slowly, then turned back to Luke. 2 days, Captain. Then we settle this, one way or another. The sheriff and his men retreated to set up camp at the tree line, just close enough to keep watch. Luke stood frozen, staring after them, his face unreadable. Finally, he turned to Grace. Why did you do that? His voice was rough. You promised you'd say you didn't know me. I lied. Grace walked toward him, closing the distance between them. I can't watch them take you away knowing I didn't try. Knowing I didn't fight for the man who fought so hard for me. Grace? 2 days, Luke. We have 2 days to finish this cabin and figure out what comes next. She reached up and touched his face, her palm against his bearded cheek. So let's not waste them. Luke closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if there's any way out of this that doesn't end with a rope. Then we'll find out together. Grace's voice was fierce. But you're not facing it alone, not anymore. Do you understand me? Luke opened his eyes, and they were bright with tears he wouldn't let fall. You're the bravest person I've ever met. Or the most foolish. I haven't decided yet. Grace smiled, trying to lighten the moment. Now, come on. We have a cabin to finish and not much time to do it. They worked through that day and into the next with focused intensity. The roof took shape, shake by painstaking shake. The door was hung, the gaps chinked with moss and mud. Luke built a fireplace and chimney with stones hauled up from the creek, his hands sure and steady despite the ticking clock. Grace helped where she could, and when the work was too heavy, she organized the interior, arranging their few supplies, sweeping the floor, making the cabin feel less like a construction site and more like a home. On the final evening, their last before Sheriff Vickery would take Luke away, they sat inside the completed cabin with a fire crackling in the new hearth. The space was small but solid, the walls tight, the roof sound. Luke had even built a simple bed frame and table, working through the night to finish them. It was beautiful in its simplicity. It was home. You did it, Grace said softly, looking around. You built me a home. We did it. Luke was carving something by firelight, his knife moving in practiced strokes. You worked just as hard as I did. But it was your vision, your skill. Grace watched him work. What are you making? You'll see. Luke finished his carving and held it up. A small wooden sign, the letters burned in with a hot iron. 2 names, Mercer and Holloway. He looked at Grace almost shyly. Thought you should have something to remember, that someone was here, that this mattered. Grace felt tears burning in her eyes. Luke, it's not much, but it's something. He stood and moved to the door, fastening the sign above the frame. There. Now it's official. Grace crossed the small room and stood beside him, looking up at their names carved into wood. This matters, she said quietly. You matter. And tomorrow, when you go with Sheriff Vickery, I'm coming with you. Luke turned to her, startled. What? No. Grace, you need to stay here. I need to testify. Grace's voice was firm. I need to tell them who you are, what you did for me. If there's going to be a trial, you need someone to speak for you. You'll be putting yourself at risk. I don't care. Grace grabbed his hand, holding tight. You told me about your wife and daughter, about how you weren't there when they needed you. Well, I'm here now, and I'm not going to let you face this alone. So you can argue all you want, but I'm coming. Luke stared at her, emotions warring across his face. Why? Why would you risk so much for me? Because... Grace stopped, searching for words. The truth was complicated, tangled up in grief and gratitude and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Because you saved me. Because you showed me what decency looks like, even when the world tried to beat it out of you. Because I believe you deserve another chance. Luke's hand tightened on hers. I don't deserve you. That's not your choice to make. Grace stepped closer, her free hand rising to rest on his chest, over his heart. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Do you understand? Luke looked down at her, and in his eyes Grace saw the man he'd been before the army broke him, before grief hollowed him out, before 8 years of running turned him into a ghost. She saw someone who wanted to believe in second chances, someone who was so tired of carrying his sins alone. Grace, he whispered, I'm so tired. I know. She could feel his heart beating under her palm, fast and strong. So stop running, face this, fight this, and let me help you. Luke pulled her into his arms then, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting. Grace wrapped her arms around him and held on just as tight, 2 broken people trying to make each other whole. They stood like that for a long time, while the fire crackled and the cabin they'd built together kept the cold at bay. Tomorrow I go with Vickery, Luke said finally, his voice muffled against her hair. And you come with me. We'll tell them the truth, all of it, and see if truth still means anything. It will. Grace pulled back enough to look at him. Truth always means something, even when it's hard. Luke cupped her face in his rough hands, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't known she'd shed. You're the best thing that's happened to me in 8 years. You know that? Grace smiled through her tears. You're not bad yourself, Mountain Man. He laughed, a real laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine. Then his expression turned serious again. If this goes wrong, if they... He stopped, swallowed hard. If they decide the rope's the answer, I need you to know something. Meeting you, building this cabin, these 5 days, they gave me my life back. Even if it's only for a little while, even if tomorrow is the end, you gave me that, thank you. It's not going to be the end, Grace's voice was fierce. I won't let it be. Grace, no, listen to me, Luke Mercer. You are not dying. Not tomorrow, not next week, not for a long time. You're going to live through this, and you're going to build more cabins, and you're going to remember what it feels like to be happy. She pulled his face down to hers, their foreheads touching. You're going to live. I promise you that. Luke closed his eyes, breathing her in. How can you have so much faith? Because someone has to. And right now, that someone is me. They stayed like that until the fire burned low, until exhaustion finally claimed them both. Luke built up the fire one more time, then joined Grace on the bed he'd built, the first real bed either of them had slept in since the storm. They lay facing each other in the firelight, hands clasped between them, neither quite willing to close their eyes and lose these final precious hours. "Grace?" Luke's voice was soft in the darkness. "Hmm? If this works out, if somehow we get through this, would you—" He trailed off, uncertain. "Would I what?" "Would you stay? Here, in this cabin, with me?" Luke squeezed her hand. "I know it's not California. I know it's not what you planned, but this place, this cabin, it could be a home. For both of us. If you wanted." Grace's heart swelled. She thought about California, about Catherine and the mercantile, and the life that had been waiting for her. Then she thought about this cabin, built with blood and sweat and hope. She thought about Luke, who'd given her more than shelter, who'd given her purpose, partnership, a reason to believe in second chances. "Yes," she whispered, "if we get through this, I'll stay." Luke's exhale was shaky with relief. "Thank you." "But Luke?" Grace moved closer until they were sharing breath in the small space between them. "We're not saying goodbye, not tonight. Tonight we're just two people who built something beautiful together, resting before whatever tomorrow brings." "Two people who built something beautiful," Luke repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." They fell asleep like that, hands clasped, promises made, the cabin they'd built keeping watch around them. And outside, in the cold dark, Sheriff Vickery sat by his own fire and wondered if maybe, just maybe, justice and mercy could live in the same sentence. Dawn came too quickly, the sun rising over the mountains like an accusation. Luke woke first, his soldier's instincts pulling him from sleep before the light fully broke. He lay still for a moment, watching Grace sleep beside him, her dark hair spread across the rough pillow he'd stuffed with dried grass, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been when he'd first found her dying in that wagon. She'd given him something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to believe tomorrow might be worth facing. But today, tomorrow came with iron shackles and a sheriff's warrant. Luke eased himself out of bed, careful not to wake her. The cabin was cold, the fire reduced to embers, and he moved quietly to build it back up. His hands worked automatically, kindling, larger pieces, the patient coaxing of flame, while his mind raced ahead to what waited in Carson Ridge. A trial. Witnesses. The truth laid bare before men who'd already decided his guilt 8 years ago. He'd run from this moment for so long that facing it felt surreal, like stepping off a cliff and hoping someone had built a bridge in the darkness. "You're thinking too loud," Grace murmured from the bed. Luke turned to find her watching him, propped on one elbow. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." The quiet did. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "What time do we leave?" "Vickery said first light. That's about an hour from now." Luke added another log to the fire, watched sparks climb toward the chimney he'd built with his own hands. "You can still change your mind, Grace. Stay here. Be safe." "We already had this argument. You lost." Grace stood, wincing slightly as weight hit her healing ankle, and crossed to him. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't do anything stupid like confessing to crimes you didn't commit." "I did commit them. I deserted. I killed Brennan." "You survived. You defended yourself." Grace touched his arm. "There's a difference, and a good lawyer will see it." "You have a lot of faith in a legal system that wanted me dead before they heard my side." "I have faith in you." Grace squeezed his arm. "Now come on, we should eat something before we go. Can't face injustice on an empty stomach." They shared a simple breakfast, dried venison and the last of the hardtack from Luke's pack, while the cabin filled with morning light. Luke found himself memorizing details, the way Grace's hands moved as she worked, the sound of her voice, the warmth of her presence in this space they'd created together. If today went wrong, if Carson Ridge became his final destination, he wanted to carry these moments with him to whatever came next. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Mercer, time to go." Sheriff Vickery's voice carried the weight of reluctance, as if he too wished circumstances were different. Luke stood, reaching for his coat. Grace was already dressed, already determined. She met his eyes across the cabin, and something passed between them, an understanding that whatever happened in Carson Ridge, they'd face it standing together. "Ready?" Luke asked. "No, but I'm coming anyway." Grace managed a small smile. "That's what brave people do, right? Show up even when they're terrified? Then we'll be brave together." They stepped outside to find Vickery and his 2 deputies waiting with horses. The sheriff had brought a spare mount, a sturdy bay mare, and held the reins out to Grace. "For you, ma'am, it's a 2-day ride to Carson Ridge. You'll need something reliable." "Thank you, Sheriff." Grace took the reins, then turned to look back at the cabin one last time. Their names were carved above the door, Mercer and Holloway, a promise made in timber and sweat. Luke followed her gaze and felt his chest tighten. "It'll still be here when we get back," Grace said softly, though her voice carried doubt she was trying to hide. "If we get back?" "When?" Grace turned to face him, her chin lifted in defiance. "When we get back, Luke, say it." "When we get back." Luke repeated the words like a vow, trying to believe them. Vickery watched this exchange with something that might have been sympathy. "Mercer, I need to put these on you." He held up a pair of iron shackles. "Regulations. You understand." Luke extended his wrists without protest. The metal was cold, the weight familiar from that brief imprisonment 8 years ago. The shackles closed with a click that sounded like a cell door slamming. Grace flinched at the sound, her hands curling into fists. "Is that really necessary?" she demanded. "He's not going to run. He gave his word." "I believe him, ma'am, but the law's the law, and I've got protocols to follow." Vickery's tone was apologetic but firm. "He won't be mistreated. You have my word on that." The ride began in silence, the small party moving through forests still deep with snow. Luke rode between his 2 deputies, his shackled hands making it difficult to manage his horse properly. Grace stayed close behind, her eyes fixed on Luke's back as if she could protect him through sheer force of will. The journey was slow, the trail treacherous, and by midday they'd covered less ground than Vickery had hoped. They stopped to rest the horses beside a half-frozen creek. One of the deputies, a young man named Harris with a sparse mustache and nervous energy, handed out jerky and canteens. Grace dismounted stiffly, her ankle protesting the hours in the saddle, and moved to sit beside Luke on a fallen log. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. "I've been worse." Luke flexed his wrists against the shackles, the metal chafing his skin. "The cabin feels like it was years ago instead of hours. It's still there, waiting." Grace pulled her coat tighter against the wind. "And when this is over, we're going back to it. We're going to hang curtains and plant a garden and make it a real home." "Grace? No, I don't want to hear your doubts right now." She looked at him fiercely. "I need you to believe this works out. I need you to see past Carson Ridge to what comes after. Can you do that for me?" Luke studied her face, the determination there, the hope she refused to surrender. "You're asking a lot." "I'm asking you to live, that's all. Just keep living, no matter what they throw at us." Grace took his shackled hands in hers, holding tight. "Promise me, Luke. Promise me you won't give up." "I promise." The words came easier than he expected. "I won't give up." Vickery cleared his throat, and they looked up to find him watching them with an unreadable expression. "We need to keep moving. Want to make the halfway point before dark." He paused, then added, "Mercer, you should know, Carson Ridge isn't what it was 8 years ago. New judge, new town council. Some folks remember you from before, remember what kind of officer you were. You might have more support than you think. Or more people wanting to see me hang." Luke stood, helping Grace to her feet. "Either way, we'll find out soon enough." They rode through the afternoon, the trail climbing into higher elevations where the wind bit with teeth of ice. Grace's ankle throbbed with each step the horse took, but she didn't complain. Luke watched her from his position ahead, saw the way she gritted her teeth against pain, the way her hands gripped the reins white-knuckled. She was suffering for him, and the knowledge sat heavy on his conscience. By evening, they reached an old trapper's shelter, little more than 3 walls and a partial roof, but enough to break the wind. Vickery called a halt, and the deputies set about building a fire while Grace helped unload supplies. Luke, still shackled, could only watch and feel useless. "Sheriff?" Luke said after the fire was crackling. The shackles. Can I have them off for the night? I give you my word I won't run. Vickery considered this, then nodded. Harris, remove them. But Mercer, you try anything. I know. You'll shoot me, and you'd be right to. Luke held out his wrists, relief flooding through him as the iron came off. His skin was raw underneath, already showing the beginnings of bruises. Grace was beside him immediately, examining the damage with worried eyes. You should have said something, she murmured, pulling out the tin of salve Luke had used on her ankle. This looks painful. It's nothing. It's not nothing. Grace spread the salve gently, her touch careful. You're allowed to hurt, Luke. You're allowed to need help. I've been taking care of myself for 8 years. Hard habit to break. Well, start breaking it. Grace finished with the salve and wrapped his wrists in clean cloth. Because you're not alone anymore. Accept it. Dinner was a quiet affair. Beans and bacon cooked over the fire, strong coffee that tasted like salvation. The deputies kept to themselves, giving Luke and Grace a small measure of privacy. Vickery sat slightly apart, smoking a pipe and watching the flames with the distant expression of a man working through complicated thoughts. Sheriff, Grace said finally, unable to bear the silence, what kind of trial can Luke expect? Will he have a chance to defend himself properly? Vickery blew smoke, considering. Judge Morrison runs a fair court. He's no Army sympathizer, but he's no bleeding heart either. The prosecutor will be William Chase, sharp as a tack, doesn't lose often. Mercer will need a good lawyer. Do you know anyone? Luke asked. Maybe. There's a man in Carson Ridge, former Army lawyer named Samuel Garrett. Got discharged for defending the wrong client, if you catch my meaning. He's not popular with the military establishment, but he knows the law inside and out. Vickery looked at Luke through the pipe smoke. If you can convince him to take your case, you might have a fighting chance. And if I can't, then you'll hang. Vickery said it without malice, just stating fact. The evidence against you is substantial. Desertion is clear-cut. You ran. The killing is trickier. Brennan's dead, can't give his side. You say self-defense, but you're the only witness. Chase will paint you as a murderer who panicked and fled. Without someone who can challenge that narrative, a jury will convict. Grace felt her stomach drop. But there must be others. People who knew Brennan was corrupt. Soldiers who saw what he was doing. If there are, they've kept quiet for 8 years. Fear's a powerful motivator, ma'am. Speaking against a dead war hero can ruin a career, even posthumously. Vickery knocked his pipe against a stone, scattering ash. But maybe with the right pressure, the right questions, someone will find their courage. That's what a good lawyer does. He finds the truth no one wants to tell. Luke stared into the fire, processing this. So my life depends on convincing a stranger to risk his reputation defending a deserter, then somehow getting witnesses to admit they've been covering up corruption for nearly a decade. Those are long odds, Sheriff. They are, but I've seen longer odds pay off. Vickery stood, stretching. Get some rest, both of you. Tomorrow's another long day, and Carson Ridge doesn't get easier with exhaustion. The deputies bedded down near the fire while Vickery took first watch. Luke and Grace spread their bedrolls close together, seeking warmth in the frigid night. Grace lay on her side, watching Luke's profile in the firelight. Samuel Garrett, she said softly. We'll find him. We'll convince him. Grace, you heard Vickery. This is a long shot wrapped in a prayer. Then we pray harder. Grace reached out, finding Luke's hand in the darkness. I didn't survive that blizzard, didn't build that cabin, didn't fall in. She stopped herself, the words catching in her throat. Didn't fall in what? Luke turned to face her, his voice gentle. Grace closed her eyes, knowing she couldn't unsay what she'd almost admitted. Didn't fall in love with a mountain man just to watch them hang him for doing the right thing. The silence that followed felt infinite. Luke's hand tightened on hers, his breathing suddenly unsteady. Grace, I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other. I know 1,000 reasons why I shouldn't feel this way. Grace opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. But I'm tired of lying, tired of pretending that what's between us is just gratitude or circumstance. You make me want to live again, Luke. Not just survive, but actually live. And I can't lose that. I can't lose you. Luke pulled her closer, until they were sharing breath in the narrow space between bedrolls. "You're the bravest, most foolish, most wonderful woman I've ever known. Is that a yes? Do you? I love you." Luke said it simply, without poetry or hesitation. "I've loved you since you gave me half your bread when you were dying, since you looked at me like I was human instead of haunted, since you trusted me enough to let me build you a home." He touched her face with rough tenderness. "I love you, Grace Holloway, and if they hang me in Carson Ridge, I'll die knowing I felt this one more time. That's more than I deserve." "It's exactly what you deserve." Grace kissed him then, a soft press of lips that tasted like hope and desperation and promises they might not get to keep. Luke kissed her back with 8 years of loneliness, with the weight of grief finally finding somewhere to rest. They held each other in the darkness, two broken people trying to become whole, while the fire crackled and the stars watched, and the future hung in uncertain balance. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying. "We're going to fight this," Grace whispered against his mouth. "We're going to win. We're going to try." Luke kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tears on her lashes. "And whatever happens, you gave me this moment, this feeling. Thank you." They slept tangled together, hearts beating in sync, while the night carried them closer to Carson Ridge and whatever judgment awaited there. Morning came with frost and anxiety. Luke's wrists went back into shackles, the iron now feeling like prophecy. They rode hard, covering ground quickly as the trail descended from the high country into the valley where Carson Ridge sat nestled against the mountains. By late afternoon, the town came into view, a collection of wood frame buildings sprawling along the main road, church steeple rising above it all like a finger pointing toward heaven or judgment, depending on your perspective. People stopped to stare as they rode down the main street. Word had clearly spread, the telegraph lines reaching even into these remote towns, carrying news faster than horses. Luke heard his name whispered, saw faces he half remembered from 8 years ago. Some looked sympathetic, others looked hungry for a hanging. Vickery led them to the sheriff's office, a sturdy building with barred windows and a sign that read, "Carson Ridge Law, Justice for All." Luke almost laughed at the irony. Vickery dismounted and helped Grace down, then turned to Luke. "Inside. We'll get you settled, then start the legal process." Vickery's voice was professionally neutral, but his eyes carried something softer. "Mrs. Holloway, there's a boarding house 2 doors down. Mrs. Chen runs it. Fair prices, clean rooms. You should get yourself situated." "I'm staying with Luke." Grace's voice was steel. "Ma'am, you can't stay in the jail." "Then I'll sit outside it. I'll sleep on the street if I have to." Grace moved closer to Luke, her hand finding his shackled ones. "I told him he wouldn't face this alone. I meant it." Vickery sighed, but didn't argue further. He led Luke inside, through a front office that smelled of tobacco and old coffee, into a cell block at the back. 3 cells lined the wall, all empty except for the one he opened for Luke. The metal door swung wide with a creak that sounded like defeat. Luke stepped inside and the door closed behind him. The sound of the lock engaging hit Grace like a physical blow. She pressed her hands against the bars, ignoring Vickery's gentle suggestion that she should go. "I'll be back in an hour," she told Luke. "I'm going to find Samuel Garrett. I'm going to get you a lawyer. Grace, don't argue, just trust me." She squeezed his hands through the bars. "We're fighting this, remember?" Luke managed to smile. "I remember." Grace left with purpose burning in her chest. She stopped first at the boarding house Sheriff Vickery had mentioned, a tidy establishment run by a Chinese woman with keen eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Mrs. Chen took one look at Grace's determination and simply nodded. "You're here for the trial, for Captain Mercer." It wasn't a question. "You know him?" "Know of him. My husband served under him briefly, before the war ended. Said Mercer was the best officer he ever knew. Fair, brave, wouldn't ask his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself." Mrs. Chen handed Grace a room key. "Whatever happened with Major Brennan, my husband never believed the official story. Said Brennan was crooked as a dog's hind leg." Hope flickered in Grace's chest. "Would your husband testify to that?" "He died 3 years back, pneumonia." Mrs. Chen's expression softened with old grief. "But he talked about it before he passed, about the men who served with them. Some still around if you know where to look." "What about Samuel Garrett, the lawyer? Do you know where I can find him? Mrs. Chen pointed down the street. Office above the general store. But be warned, Garrett doesn't take cases lightly. You'll need to convince him you're worth the trouble. Grace thanked her and hurried back onto the street. The afternoon sun was already sinking toward the mountains, painting everything gold and orange. She found the general store easily, a large establishment that seemed to carry everything from farming equipment to fancy fabrics. Beside it, a narrow staircase led to a second-floor office. The sign on the door read, Samuel Garrett, Attorney at Law, Honest Work for Honest Pay. Grace knocked. It's open, a voice called from inside. She entered to find a small office crammed with law books and case files. A man sat behind a cluttered desk, mid-40s, with graying hair and spectacles perched on a sharp nose. He looked up at Grace with the expression of someone perpetually surprised by humanity's capacity for trouble. If you're here to sue your neighbor about the property line, I'm booked until March. If it's a divorce, April. If it's anything else, tell me fast because I've got a brief due tomorrow. Garrett's voice was rapid fire, no nonsense. I'm here about Captain Luke Mercer. Garrett's expression shifted from harried to interested. Ah, the deserter. Heard they brought him in. You're not family, wrong last name, and he doesn't have any living relatives that I know of. So, who are you? Grace Holloway. He saved my life in a blizzard 6 days ago, then spent 5 days building me a cabin so I wouldn't freeze come next storm. Grace sat down without being invited. And now I'm here to make sure he doesn't hang for defending himself against a corrupt officer. Garrett leaned back in his chair, studying her with eyes that missed nothing. You're in love with him. Grace blinked. What? You're in love with him? I can see it in the way you talk about him, the way your hands shake when you say his name. You're here because you love him, not just because he saved you. Garrett tapped his desk thoughtfully. That's good. Love makes people fight harder, but it also makes them blind to reality. So let me lay it out for you, Mrs. Holloway. Miss Holloway. Luke Mercer is accused of desertion and murder. The evidence of desertion is ironclad. He ran, that's indisputable. The murder charge is trickier, but without witnesses to support his version of events, it becomes his word against a dead war hero's reputation. Major Brennan is remembered fondly by the Army brass. They'll fight to protect that memory, which means fighting to convict Mercer. The odds are not good. Mrs. Chen said her husband served under them both, said Brennan was corrupt. Did he file a report, give testimony, leave written evidence? He's dead. Then it's hearsay. Worthless in court. Garrett shook his head. I'd need living witnesses, soldiers who saw Brennan's corruption firsthand and are willing to testify despite the risk to their own reputations. Do you have any of those? Not yet, but they exist. They have to. Grace leaned forward. Mr. Garrett, I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand all the legal complications, but I understand people. And Luke Mercer is a good man who made an impossible choice. He killed a man who was stealing from the army, selling weapons to hostile forces, putting soldiers' lives at risk. Then he ran because he knew no one would believe him. Was he wrong to run? Maybe. But he spent 8 years trying to atone for it. Doesn't that count for something? Garrett was quiet, his fingers drumming on the desk. It counts, but not enough. Not without evidence. Then help me find evidence. Help me find witnesses. Help me give Luke a fighting chance. Grace's voice cracked with emotion. Please. He's the first thing I've cared about since my husband died. The first person who's made me believe life could be good again. I can't lose him. I won't. Garrett studied her for a long moment, then sighed and pulled out a notebook. Tell me everything. Start with how you met and don't leave anything out. If I'm going to defend a deserter against the United States Army, I need to know exactly what I'm working with. Grace told him everything. The blizzard, the wagon, Luke's confession about his wife and daughter, the cabin, the arrest, the ride to Carson Ridge. She told him about the pocket watch and the carved sign above the door. She told him about falling in love with a man who'd forgotten how to believe in his own worth. Garrett listened, taking notes, occasionally asking sharp questions that cut to the heart of things. When she finished, full dark had fallen outside. Garrett set down his pen and removed his spectacles, rubbing his eyes. All right, here's what I can do. I'll take the case. No fee unless we win, which tells you how confident I am. I'll file the necessary motions, Get the trial scheduled as fast as possible. The longer Mercer sits in that cell, the more the town talks, and right now the talk isn't favorable. I'll also start digging for witnesses. There were men under Brennan's command who knew what he was doing. Some might have left the army, might feel safe enough now to talk. It's a long shot, but it's what we have. Thank you. Grace felt tears of relief burning. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet. Thank me if we win. Garrett stood, already moving to gather files. Go back to Mercer. Tell him he has representation. Tell him to keep his mouth shut unless I'm present. Don't let the prosecutor trick him into saying anything incriminating. And Miss Holloway? Get some rest. This fight is going to be brutal, and you'll need your strength. Grace left the office feeling something she hadn't felt since Sheriff Vickery arrived at the cabin. Hope. It was fragile, battered, but it was there. She hurried back to the jail, where Vickery was locking up for the night. He has a lawyer, Grace announced. Samuel Garrett is taking the case. Vickery's eyebrows rose. Garrett? That's good. He's tough. Knows his way around military law. Mercer's got a real chance now. Grace moved past him to the cell block where Luke sat on a narrow cot, head in his hands. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and the hope in his eyes broke her heart. Samuel Garrett is representing you, Grace said through the bars. He's good, Luke. He's going to fight for you. Luke stood and crossed to the bars, reaching through to take her hands. You did that. You found him, convinced him. I told him the truth, that you're worth fighting for. Grace held his gaze. He's going to look for witnesses, people who knew about Brennan's corruption. We're going to prove you were right, Luke. We're going to clear your name. Grace, don't give up, please. Don't give up. Tears were streaming down her face now, unchecked. I love you. I need you to live. I need you to come back to that cabin with me and make good on all those promises we didn't say out loud but both know we made. Luke pulled her as close as the bars allowed, his forehead pressed against hers. I love you too. So much it terrifies me. And I'm going to fight, I swear it. I'm going to fight like hell to come back to you. They stood like that until Vickery gently reminded Grace that visiting hours were over. She left reluctantly, looking back at Luke until the cell block door closed between them. Then she walked through the dark streets to Mrs. Chen's boarding house, climbed the stairs to her rented room, and cried herself to sleep while praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening that justice and mercy might, just this once, be the same thing. The next morning brought Samuel Garrett to the jail with an armload of legal documents and a sharp gleam in his eye. Grace was already there, having arrived at dawn, and Vickery let them all into the cell block for a private consultation. Garrett got right to business. Captain Mercer, I'm Samuel Garrett. Miss Holloway has filled me in on the basics, but I need to hear your side from the beginning. Every detail, no matter how small, everything that happened with Major Brennan, every witness to his corruption, every piece of evidence that might still exist. Luke took a deep breath and began to talk. He told Garrett about discovering discrepancies in the munitions reports, about following the trail to Brennan, about confronting him in his quarters. He described the fight, the gun, the split-second choice between defending himself and dying. He talked about the aftermath, the accusations, the court-martial he never got to attend, the escape during transfer. Garrett took meticulous notes, interrupting frequently with questions. Who else knew about the munitions discrepancies? My sergeant, Tom Winters, and a supply clerk named Martinez. Where are they now? Winters stayed in the Army, far as I know. Martinez got discharged. Medical reasons, I think. Lost a hand in a training accident. Anyone else present when you confronted Brennan? No, that's why it's my word against his reputation. Garrett tapped his pen against his notebook. Not necessarily. Brennan's quarters were in the officers' barracks, yes? Someone might have heard the fight, heard the gunshot. We need to find them. They talked for 2 hours. Garrett extracting every possible detail while Grace listened and occasionally contributed questions of her own. By the end, Garrett had filled half his notebook and was looking slightly more optimistic than when he'd started. All right, here's the plan. The trial is set for 1 week from today. Judge Morrison expedited it at my request. In that week, I need to find Winters and Martinez, plus anyone else who served under Brennan. I'll also file motions to compel the Army to release Brennan's service records, particularly the munitions reports you mentioned. If those discrepancies exist on paper, it supports your claim of corruption. Garrett stood, gathering his papers. In the meantime, Mercer, you sit tight. Don't talk to anyone except me and Miss Holloway. The prosecutor will try to interview you. Refuse, politely, but firmly. Understand? I understand. Luke's voice was steady, but Grace could see the tension in his shoulders. Thank you, Mr. Garrett, for taking this on. Thank Miss Holloway. She's the one who convinced me you were worth the trouble. Garrett allowed himself a small smile. Don't make me regret it. After Garrett left, Grace stayed with Luke as long as Vickery allowed. They talked about small things, the cabin, the weather, Grace's room at the boarding house, carefully avoiding the trial and what might happen if they lost. But the unspoken fear hung between them like smoke, impossible to ignore completely. 1 week, Grace said as she prepared to leave. 1 week until we know. 1 week until I find out if I get to keep my life. Luke tried to smile. No pressure. We're going to win. Grace said it fiercely, willing it to be true. Garrett will find the witnesses. The truth will come out. Justice will prevail. You really believe that? I have to. The alternative is unthinkable. Grace kissed him through the bars, a desperate press of lips that tasted like goodbye, even though she refused to accept it could be. I'll be back tomorrow, and every day after until they let you walk out of here a free man. Luke watched her go, then sat back on his cot and stared at the ceiling of his cell. 1 week to prove he'd been right to kill Brennan. 1 week to convince 12 strangers that justice had required blood. 1 week to earn the life he'd only just learned he wanted to live. It felt both eternal and impossibly short, time moving in strange ways when your future hung in balance. Luke closed his eyes and thought of Grace, of the cabin, of their names carved above the door. He thought of Sarah and Lily, of the 8 years he'd spent punishing himself for failing them. Maybe this trial was a chance at something more than acquittal. Maybe it was a chance at redemption, the real kind, earned through truth instead of running. Outside the cell, in a boarding house down the street, Grace lit a candle and knelt beside her bed. She hadn't prayed in months, hadn't felt the presence of God since Thomas died. But she prayed now, for Luke, for Garrett, for witnesses brave enough to speak truth to power. She prayed for a world where good men didn't have to die for doing right. She prayed for one more chance to see her name beside his, carved in wood above a door that led to home. And in a cluttered office above a general store, Samuel Garrett pored over 8-year-old military records and composed telegrams to men he hoped were still alive, still honest, still willing to face the consequences of telling the truth they'd buried for almost a decade. The week ahead would test them all. But for now, in the darkness before dawn, 3 people held on to hope like a lifeline, determined to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, the mountain didn't get to keep what it claimed. The week crawled by with agonizing slowness, each day stretching longer than the last. Grace spent her mornings at the jail with Luke, her afternoons helping Garrett prepare for trial, and her nights lying awake in Mrs. Chen's boarding house, wondering if love could survive the gallows. The town of Carson Ridge watched their struggle with the detached interest of spectators at a play, some rooting for the underdog while others sharpened their appetite for a hanging. On the second day, Garrett received a telegram from Santa Fe. His hands shook slightly as he read it, then looked up at Grace with something that might have been triumph. Martinez, the supply clerk. He's alive and he remembers the discrepancies in Brennan's reports. Says he'll testify if we can guarantee his safety. Grace's heart leaped. That's wonderful. When can he get here? He's traveling by train, should arrive 2 days before the trial. But Grace... Garrett's expression sobered. His testimony alone won't be enough. Martinez was a clerk. He can testify about numbers not adding up, but he can't speak to what Brennan was actually doing with those missing munitions. We need someone higher up the chain of command, someone who witnessed the corruption directly. What about Sergeant Winters? Still looking. The Army's been less than helpful about providing his current assignment. Garrett tossed the telegram onto his desk with frustration. It's like they're deliberately stonewalling us, which, given what's at stake, they probably are. Grace spent that afternoon at the general store, gathering supplies she told herself they'd need for the journey back to the cabin after Luke was acquitted. Flour, sugar, coffee, seeds for that garden she kept promising they'd plant. The store owner, a thin man named Pettigrew with skeptical eyes, rang up her purchases with barely concealed judgment. "You're the woman standing by that deserter," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. "I'm standing by an innocent man who defended himself against corruption." Grace met his gaze steadily. "And when the trial proves that, I expect you'll remember this conversation." Pettigrew snorted. "If he's innocent, why'd he run? Innocent men don't hide in mountains for 8 years. Scared men do. Men who know the system is rigged against them do." Grace gathered her packages. "Have you ever been that scared, Mr. Pettigrew? Scared enough to choose survival over vindication?" The store owner didn't answer, but something flickered in his expression. Perhaps recognition, perhaps memory of his own cowardice. Grace left with her supplies and walked back toward the jail, passing clusters of townspeople who fell silent when they saw her. She was becoming a fixture in Carson Ridge, the widow who loved a killer, and the town didn't quite know what to make of her stubborn faith. Luke was standing at the cell window when she arrived, his hands gripping the bars as he stared out at the slice of sky visible from his prison. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and Grace saw the toll captivity was taking. Shadows under his eyes, tension in his jaw, a restlessness in his movements that spoke of a man used to mountains and freedom now caged like an animal. "Martinez is coming," Grace said without preamble. "He'll testify about the munitions discrepancies." Luke's expression shifted from despair to something fragile and dangerous. Hope. "When?" "2 days before trial. Garrett's still looking for Winters." Grace pulled a chair close to the bars, settling in for the daily vigil that had become her routine. "How are you holding up?" "I've been in worse prisons. At least this one has you visiting." Luke managed a weak smile. "Tell me something good, Grace. Tell me about the cabin, what it'll look like when we get back." Grace understood what he was really asking. "Paint me a future where I'm alive to see it." So she did. She described hanging blue curtains in the windows, planting vegetables in the clearing, building a chicken coop for the hens they'd buy in town. She talked about winter evenings by the fire and summer mornings with the door open to birdsong. She painted a picture of ordinary domestic happiness, the kind of life that seemed impossible from inside a jail cell, but was the only thing worth fighting for. "And children?" Luke asked softly. "Would there be children in this future?" Grace felt her breath catch. They danced around this topic before, but he'd never asked it so directly. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. 2, maybe 3. We'd teach them to love the mountains without fearing them, to be brave and kind and honest. They'd have your strength, your faith." Luke's hand found hers through the bars. "That's a good future, Grace, worth living for." "Well, then live for it. Fight for it." She squeezed his hand. "Because I'm not raising those imaginary children alone." That evening, Garrett burst into the boarding house dining room where Grace was picking at her supper. His face was flushed with exertion, his clothes dusty from hard riding. "I found him, Winters. He's at Fort Mason, 3 days hard ride from here. I've already sent word requesting his presence at the trial as a material witness." Grace stood so quickly her chair scraped. "Will he come?" "He's being ordered to come. Whether he'll testify truthfully once he's here," Garrett shrugged. "That's the gamble. But Grace, I also found something else. A chaplain who served with Mercer's unit. Father Benedict. He's retired now, living in Denver, but he's agreed to testify about Mercer's character. Says Mercer was the most honorable officer he ever knew. Character witnesses are good, but they don't prove Brennan was corrupt." "I know." Garrett dropped into a chair, exhausted. "I'm doing everything I can, Grace, but I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that it won't be enough, that despite our best efforts, a jury might still convict." Grace felt her world tilt. "Don't say that." "I have to say it. You need to be realistic." Garrett's voice was gentle but firm. "The prosecutor, Chase, is building his case on facts that are indisputable. Mercer deserted. He killed his commanding officer. Those are the anchors Chase will use to sink us. Everything else is he said testimony about a dead man's corruption. Juries don't like speaking ill of the dead, especially war heroes. We're asking them to believe the worst about Major Brennan while taking the word of a man who ran rather than face justice. That's a hard sell. But it's the truth. Truth doesn't always win in court. Sometimes the best story wins. Garrett rubbed his face tiredly. I'll do my best, Grace. I swear it. But you need to be strong enough to handle either outcome. Grace nodded numbly, but inside she was screaming. She wasn't strong enough. She'd never be strong enough to watch Luke hang. The thought of it paralyzed her. Luke on a scaffold, rope around his neck, dying while she watched helplessly. It would destroy her more thoroughly than Thomas's death had, because this time she'd know it was coming and be powerless to stop it. The third day brought Martinez to Carson Ridge, a middle-aged Mexican man with one hand and nervous eyes that darted constantly as if expecting ambush. Garrett brought him directly to the jail for a meeting with Luke, and Grace sat in on the conversation, watching two men who'd once served together reconnect across 8 years and a cell door. Captain Mercer. Martinez's voice carried respect despite Luke's current circumstances. It's been a long time, sir. Martinez, you look well. Luke studied the man's missing hand. I heard about the accident. I'm sorry. Not your fault, sir. Training mishap. Pure bad luck. Martinez shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Garrett tells me you need me to testify about the munitions discrepancies, about Major Brennan. Only if you're willing. I won't ask you to risk your reputation for me. Martinez laughed bitterly. My reputation? Captain, I'm a one-handed former supply clerk living in a boarding house in Santa Fe. I got no reputation left to risk, but the truth? That I got plenty of. And the truth is, Major Brennan was stealing from the United States Army and getting soldiers killed doing it. Luke's expression hardened with vindication. Can you prove it? I kept copies of the reports, the real ones, showing actual inventory versus what Brennan reported. Figured someday someone might care about the truth. Guess that day is now. Martinez pulled a worn leather folder from his coat. It's all here, Captain. Every discrepancy, every missing rifle, every crate of ammunition that disappeared and reappeared on hostile tribal lands. Brennan was smart, but he wasn't careful. The numbers don't lie. Garrett practically snatched the folder, his eyes scanning the documents with growing excitement. This is gold. This is exactly what we need. Martinez, you're a godsend. I'm a man with a guilty conscience who should have spoken up 8 years ago. Martinez looked at Luke through the bars. I'm sorry, sir. Sorry I didn't testify at your court-martial. Sorry I let fear keep me quiet. I told myself it wasn't my place to question officers, that the truth would come out eventually. But it didn't, did it? And you paid the price. You're here now. That's what matters. Luke's voice was thick with emotion. Thank you, Martinez, for keeping those records, for having the courage to come forward. Just telling the truth, sir, like you taught us to do. That night in Mrs. Chen's boarding house, Grace allowed herself to believe they might actually win. Martinez's testimony combined with the documentary evidence could prove Brennan's corruption. Winners could corroborate Luke's version of events. Father Benedict could speak to Luke's character. It was all coming together, pieces of a puzzle that might actually form a picture of innocence. She was lying in bed, thinking about blue curtains and vegetable gardens, when someone knocked urgently at her door. Grace grabbed her robe and opened it to find Mrs. Chen, her face grave. Miss Holloway, Sheriff Vickery is downstairs, says it's urgent. Grace's heart plummeted. She dressed quickly and hurried down to find Vickery in the parlor, his hat in his hands and trouble written across his face. What's wrong? Is Luke? Mercer's fine, but we have a problem. Vickery's voice was tight. William Chase, the prosecutor, just filed a motion to exclude Martinez's testimony and documents. Claims they're hearsay and prejudicial. Says there's no way to verify their authenticity since Brennan's dead and can't defend himself against accusations of corruption. Grace felt the floor drop out from under her. Can he do that? Can Chase just exclude evidence? He can file the motion. Judge Morrison will rule on it tomorrow morning. Vickery looked miserable. I don't know which way he'll go. Morrison's fair, but he's also a stickler for legal procedure. If Chase makes a compelling argument about authenticity and hearsay, the judge might exclude the documents. But that's our entire case. Without Martinez's evidence, I know. Vickery set his hat down, his shoulders sagging. That's why I'm here. To prepare you for the possibility that tomorrow doesn't go our way. Grace sat down heavily, her mind racing. We need to tell Garrett. He needs to prepare a response, argue against the motion. He already knows. I stopped at his office first. He's working on it now, preparing citations and precedents. Vickery's voice gentled. But Grace, you need to understand. Even with the best argument, we might lose this motion. And if we do, Mercer's chances drop considerably. I wanted you to hear it from me, not as a surprise in court tomorrow. After Vickery left, Grace sat in the dark parlor for a long time, wrestling with fear and rage. How was this justice? They had evidence, they had witnesses, they had truth on their side, but legal technicalities might silence it all. She thought about going to the jail, but what would she tell Luke? That after all their hope, after all their fighting, it might come down to a judge's interpretation of hearsay rules? Instead, she knelt on the parlor floor and prayed with an intensity that surprised her. She prayed for Judge Morrison's wisdom, for Garrett's eloquence, for Martinez's courage. She prayed for a world where good men didn't die for doing right. She prayed until her knees ached and dawn light crept through the windows, and then she rose and prepared to face whatever the day would bring. The courthouse was already filling when Grace arrived the next morning. The motion hearing had drawn a crowd. Carson Ridge didn't get much excitement, and a military court-martial survivor defending himself against murder charges was the most entertainment the town had seen in years. Grace pushed through the crowd to where Garrett stood with Martinez near the defense table, both men looking grim. "What are our chances?" Grace asked without preamble. 50-50, maybe 60-40 against us. Garrett kept his voice low. Chase's argument is technically sound. The documents are potentially hearsay, and without Brennan alive to authenticate or dispute them, their reliability is questionable. I'm going to argue they fall under the business records exception to hearsay, that Martinez can authenticate them as the person who created them, and that excluding them would deny Mercer his constitutional right to present a defense. But Morrison could go either way. Grace looked across the courtroom to where William Chase sat with military precision, his papers organized in neat stacks, his expression confident. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp features and calculating eyes that missed nothing. He caught Grace staring and offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a predator acknowledging prey. All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Morrison. The courtroom stood as one, and Grace watched an older black man with steel-gray hair take the bench. Judge Morrison had the bearing of someone who'd seen humanity at its worst and still believed in the possibility of justice. He settled into his chair, adjusted his spectacles, and surveyed the courtroom with eyes that promised nothing but fairness. "Be seated. We're here on the matter of the prosecution's motion to exclude certain documentary evidence and witness testimony in the case of United States versus Captain Luke Mercer. Mr. Chase, I've read your motion. Proceed with your argument." Chase stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. "Thank you, Your Honor. The prosecution moves to exclude the testimony of one Miguel Martinez and associated documents purporting to show irregularities in Major William Brennan's munitions reports. These documents are classic hearsay, out-of-court statements offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted, specifically that Major Brennan engaged in theft and corruption. Major Brennan is deceased and cannot defend himself against these allegations. Moreover, there's no way to verify the document's authenticity. Mr. How was it put? Martinez claims he created them 8 years ago, but he could have fabricated them yesterday to help his former commanding officer. The defense cannot provide chain of custody, cannot produce witnesses to the document's creation, cannot do anything except ask this court to take Mr. Martinez's word that he's telling the truth about a dead war hero. That's not justice, Your Honor. That's character assassination masquerading as evidence." Chase sat down with the satisfaction of someone who'd made an airtight argument. Grace felt her stomach clench. When he laid it out like that, the motion seemed reasonable, almost inevitable. She looked at Garrett, silently pleading. Garrett stood, and his voice when he spoke carried the weight of a man fighting for more than just a legal argument. "Your Honor, the prosecution's motion is a transparent attempt to prevent this jury from hearing the truth. Yes, these documents are technically hearsay, but they fall squarely within the business records exception. Mr. Martinez created these records in the ordinary course of his duties as a supply clerk. They were made contemporaneously with the events they describe. They were kept in the regular course of military business. Every element of the business records exception is satisfied." Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Garrett, The business records exception typically requires the records to have been maintained by the entity that created them. These are copies Mr. Martinez allegedly kept privately. That changes the analysis, does it not? It changes the circumstances, Your Honor, but not the fundamental reliability. Mr. Martinez will testify under oath that these are true copies of official Army records, records he personally created and maintained. The prosecution is correct that Major Brennan cannot defend himself, but that's because Major Brennan is dead by the defendant's hand in what Captain Mercer claims was self-defense. Should a defendant be denied the right to prove why he felt his life was in danger simply because the person who threatened him is deceased? That would create a perverse incentive for prosecutors to exclude any evidence that explains the defendant's state of mind during a killing. Chase jumped to his feet. Your Honor, the defendant's state of mind can be established through his own testimony. He doesn't need 8-year-old documents of questionable provenance to explain why he killed Major Brennan. But he does need to prove Major Brennan was corrupt, because that goes directly to whether Brennan would have killed him to hide that corruption, Garrett shot back. Self-defense isn't just about feeling scared. It's about having reasonable grounds for that fear. These documents prove Captain Mercer had every reason to believe Major Brennan would kill him to protect a lucrative theft operation. Without these documents, the jury will think this is just a subordinate officer who killed his superior in a fit of rage. With these documents, they'll see the truth, that this was survival, not murder. Morrison held up a hand, silencing both lawyers. The courtroom held its collective breath while the judge reviewed the papers before him, his expression unreadable. Grace watched his face, trying to discern which way he was leaning, but Morrison had decades of practice keeping his thoughts hidden. Finally, the judge spoke. Mr. Chase, your concerns about authenticity are noted. However, the defendant has a constitutional right to present a complete defense. Mr. Martinez's testimony and these documents go directly to the heart of that defense, namely, whether Captain Mercer had reason to fear for his life when he killed Major Brennan. The court finds that the probative value of this evidence outweighs its potential prejudicial effect. The business records exception applies, and Mr. Martinez's personal custody of the copies goes to weight rather than admissibility. The motion is denied. Grace nearly sobbed with relief. Garrett's shoulders sagged, the tension draining from him. Martinez closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Across the room, Chase's jaw tightened, but he nodded stiffly and sat down. Morrison wasn't finished. However, Mr. Garrett, the court is putting you on notice. The authenticity of these documents will be rigorously tested during trial. If Mr. Chase can demonstrate their fabrications are otherwise unreliable, I reserve the right to strike them from the record and instruct the jury to disregard Mr. Martinez's testimony. Is that clear? Crystal clear, Your Honor. Thank you. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for jury selection. Both counsel be prepared. I want this trial moving efficiently. We're not going to drag this out for weeks while the town gawks and the defendant sits in a cell. Justice delayed is justice denied. Understood? Both lawyers nodded. Morrison's gavel fell, and the courtroom erupted into conversation. Grace fought through the crowd to reach Garrett, who was already packing his briefcase with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline. "We won," Grace breathed. "We actually won." "We won this round. The trial itself is another matter entirely." But Garrett was smiling, the first genuine smile Grace had seen from him. "But yes, this is good, very good. Martinez can testify, the jury will see the evidence of Brennan's corruption, and suddenly our case has teeth. Can I tell Luke? Be my guest. He deserves some good news." Garrett squeezed her shoulder. "But Grace, remember what Morrison said. Chase is going to attack the document's authenticity during trial. He'll try to prove Martinez fabricated them, or that they're somehow unreliable. We need to be ready for that." Grace nodded and hurried to the jail, where Vickery was waiting with Luke standing at the cell door, his face pale with anxiety. "Well?" Morrison denied the motion. Martinez can testify. The documents are admissible. Grace felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief and joy and desperate hope. "Luke, we have a real chance now. A real chance to prove you were right." Luke gripped the bars so hard his knuckles went white. His eyes were bright with emotion he couldn't quite name. "Thank God. Thank God and thank you." He reached through to cup Grace's face, his thumb brushing away her tears. I was preparing myself for the worst. Vickery told me about the motion, and I thought, don't. Don't think about what might have been. Think about tomorrow. Think about jury selection and the trial and walking out of here a free man. Grace covered his hand with hers, holding tight. We're going to win this, Luke. I feel it. You've felt it since the beginning. Your faith has been the only thing keeping me standing. Luke's voice dropped to a whisper. I don't deserve you, Grace Holloway. Good thing it's not about deserving. It's about choosing. Grace smiled through her tears. And I choose you, every time, no matter what. That night, Grace slept better than she had in days. Her dreams filled with blue curtains and vegetable gardens, and Luke's arms around her in a cabin that smelled of pine and promise. She woke to sunlight and birdsong and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, the universe was finally tilting in their favor. Jury selection began promptly at 9 the next morning. Grace sat in the front row directly behind the defense table where Luke sat shackled between two deputies. He'd been given clean clothes for the trial, a simple shirt and trousers that made him look less like a mountain hermit and more like the army captain he'd once been. His beard was trimmed, his hair combed, and Grace could see hints of the man he'd been before grief and running had carved him hollow. Morrison presided over the selection with brisk efficiency, dismissing potential jurors who admitted they couldn't be impartial and questioning others closely about their views on military justice and self-defense. Chase used his challenges to eliminate anyone who seemed sympathetic to soldiers or skeptical of authority. Garrett struck anyone with obvious military loyalty or who seemed eager for a hanging. By late afternoon, they had their jury, 12 men ranging from farmers to shopkeepers to a retired schoolteacher. Grace studied each face, trying to read them, trying to discern who might be sympathetic and who was already measuring rope. The schoolteacher, a thin man named Aldridge, looked thoughtful and serious. A young farmer named Brennan, no relation to the major, he'd assured them, seemed uncomfortable with the whole proceeding. An older merchant named Holloway, also no relation to Grace, kept stealing glances at Luke as if trying to reconcile the shackled prisoner with the accusations. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Morrison addressed them once selection was complete. You've been chosen to render judgment in a serious matter. Tomorrow morning, we'll hear opening statements, and then testimony will begin. I expect you to listen carefully, evaluate evidence objectively, and render a verdict based solely on what you hear in this courtroom. Not on gossip, not on prejudice, not on sympathy, but on facts and law. Can you do that? The jurors nodded solemnly. Morrison dismissed them with instructions to avoid discussing the case with anyone, and then court was adjourned until morning. Grace watched the jurors file out, trying to find hope in their faces. Some looked curious, some looked bored, some looked like they'd already made up their minds. 12 strangers who would decide if Luke lived or died. The weight of that reality pressed down on Grace like a physical thing. Luke was led back to his cell, and Grace followed after a brief consultation with Garrett. Opening statements, the lawyer said. That's where we set the narrative. Chase will paint Mercer as a deserter and murderer. I need to paint him as a hero who made an impossible choice. Grace, I may call you as a witness. Would you be comfortable with that? Anything. I'll do anything to help. Good. Because your testimony about Luke building that cabin, about the man he is versus the man Chase will try to portray, that could be powerful. Juries respond to human stories, not just legal arguments. Garrett packed his briefcase. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow, the real fight begins. But Grace couldn't rest. She lay awake in her boarding house room, listening to Carson Ridge settle into night, thinking about 12 men who held Luke's future in their hands. She thought about Thomas, about the life she'd lost, and the one she might be about to lose again. She thought about that cabin in the mountains, standing empty, waiting to become either a home or a monument. Somewhere across town, in his cell, Luke was doing the same, lying awake, counting heartbeats, wondering if he'd have enough tomorrows to make good on all the promises he'd made. He thought about Grace, about the way she looked at him like he was worth saving. He thought about Sarah and Lily, about 8 years of running finally coming to an end one way or another. He thought about standing before God or a jury, or both, and having to explain why he'd chosen survival over surrender, why he'd killed rather than die. And in a hotel room near the courthouse, William Chase reviewed his notes and prepared to argue for a hanging. He had no personal animosity toward Luke Mercer. This was just a case, just a career move, just another day in court. The facts were clear: desertion and murder. Everything else was noise. Chase would cut through that noise with precision, would strip away Garrett's emotional appeals and leave only the stark truth of what Mercer had done. A captain had killed his major and run. That deserved death. Simple as that. 3 people. 3 versions of truth, all colliding in a courtroom where 12 strangers would decide which story to believe. Grace fell asleep finally, near dawn, still praying for wisdom and mercy and a future where love was stronger than law. She woke to someone knocking urgently at her door. Gray light filtered through the window. Too early for trial. Something was wrong. Grace pulled on her robe and opened the door to find Vickery, his face drawn. "What happened?" "Winters. Sergeant Tom Winters." Vickery's voice was tight. "He arrived in town an hour ago. Garrett's meeting with him now at the courthouse. He wanted you to know Winters is willing to testify, but there's a problem." Grace's heart sank. What kind of problem? The kind where Winters admits he knew about Brennan's corruption, admits he should have reported it, admits he kept quiet out of fear. He'll support Mercer's version of events, but Chase is going to crucify him on cross-examination, make him look like a coward who's lying now to ease his own guilty conscience. Vickery shook his head. "Garrett thinks the testimony might do more harm than good. He wants to talk to you and Mercer before deciding whether to call Winters as a witness." Grace dressed quickly and followed Vickery through Carson Ridge's empty pre-dawn streets. The courthouse loomed ahead, its windows lit from within. Inside she found Garrett and a man she assumed was Winters. Late 40s, graying hair, the hard-worn look of someone who'd seen too much combat. He stood when Grace entered, military courtesy automatic. "Ma'am, you must be Miss Holloway." Winters' voice carried the rough edges of a career soldier. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Can you help Luke? Can your testimony save him?" Grace didn't have energy for pleasantries. Winters glanced at Garrett, who nodded permission to speak frankly. "I can testify that Major Brennan was corrupt, that Captain Mercer confronted him about it, that I heard the fight and the gunshot. I can support everything the captain claims happened. But Miss Holloway, I have to be honest with you. I kept quiet for 8 years. I let an innocent man run rather than risk my own career. Chase is going to tear me apart for that, and rightfully so. The jury might decide I'm lying now to clear my conscience. But you're telling the truth." Truth and believability aren't always the same thing in a courtroom. Garrett's voice was heavy. "Grace, I need you to understand what we're risking if I put Winters on the stand. Yes, he corroborates Luke's story, but Chase will use him to argue that if Winters knew Brennan was corrupt and didn't report it, then the corruption couldn't have been that serious. He'll suggest Winters and Mercer are both covering for each other, that this is a conspiracy between soldiers who didn't like their commanding officer. It could backfire badly." Grace felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. "What does Luke think?" "I haven't told him yet. I wanted to talk to you first." Garrett looked at her seriously. "Grace, this is going to affect you too. If Winters testifies and the jury doesn't believe him, it damages our entire case. It makes Luke look guilty by association. But if we don't call him, we're missing a key witness who can directly support Luke's version of events. What do you think we should do?" Grace looked at Winters, this stranger who'd stayed silent for 8 years while Luke ran. She wanted to hate him for his cowardice, but she saw the guilt eating at him, saw the man who'd finally found courage too late to prevent suffering, but maybe not too late to end it. "Sergeant Winters, if you testify, will you tell the absolute truth, no matter how badly it reflects on you?" "Yes, ma'am. Every ugly bit of it." "Then you testify." Grace's voice was firm. "We tell the whole truth and trust the jury to see it for what it is. Anything less is just another form of running." Garrett studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Winters, you're going on the stand, but Grace, I'm warning you, this could go very badly. Chase is going to eviscerate him." "Let him try." Grace straightened her shoulders. "We're not afraid of the truth anymore, are we, Sergeant?" Winters managed a grim smile. "No, ma'am. Not anymore." The trial began at 9 sharp with opening statements. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with townspeople eager for drama. Grace sat directly behind Luke, her hand occasionally reaching through the barrier to touch his shoulder, reminding him she was there. Luke sat straight-backed and still, his soldiers' discipline serving him well, even as Chase stood to deliver the prosecution's opening. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a simple case dressed up in complicated excuses. Chase's voice was clear, authoritative, the voice of someone used to being believed. The defendant, Captain Luke Mercer, deserted his post in the United States Army. He killed his commanding officer, Major William Brennan, and then he ran for 8 years, hiding in the mountains like a common criminal. These facts are not in dispute. The defendant admits them all. What he wants you to believe is that somehow these actions were justified, that Major Brennan was corrupt and dangerous, that killing him was self-defense rather than murder. But here's what the defendant can't explain. If he was truly innocent, why didn't he stay and prove it? Why did he run? Why did he let 8 years pass, letting the truth, his truth, grow cold and unprovable? I'll tell you why. Because there is no truth to his story. Because Major Brennan was a decorated officer who died unable to defend himself against these posthumous accusations. The defendant wants you to ignore the simple facts, desertion and murder, and instead believe a convenient story concocted to justify the unjustifiable. Don't let him. Don't let a killer walk free because he spins a good tale. Hold him accountable for what he did. Find him guilty. Give Major Brennan the justice he deserves. Chase sat down to a courtroom buzzing with reaction. Grace felt her chest tighten with rage at how reasonable he'd made it sound, how simple. Just a deserter and a murderer spinning lies. She looked at Luke and saw the same frustration, the same helplessness of knowing the truth, but having to wait for the chance to speak it. Then Garrett stood, and the courtroom quieted. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chase is right about one thing. Captain Luke Mercer did kill Major William Brennan, but everything else Mr. Chase just told you is a lie built on omissions and assumptions. Let me tell you what really happened. Captain Mercer discovered that his commanding officer was stealing from the United States Army, selling rifles and ammunition that should have protected American soldiers to hostile forces that would use them to kill American soldiers. When Captain Mercer confronted Major Brennan about this corruption, Brennan drew his weapon. Captain Mercer had seconds to choose, die silent or defend himself and face injustice. He chose to live. And then yes, he ran. Because 8 years ago, the Army had already decided he was guilty before hearing his defense. They were going to hang him not for killing a corrupt officer, but for embarrassing the institution that had protected that corruption. So Captain Mercer did what any rational human being would do when faced with a system rigged against him. He survived. He spent 8 years in the wilderness, alone, grieving, punishing himself for that choice, until he met Grace Holloway, saved her life in a blizzard, and remembered what it felt like to be human, to be decent, to believe that maybe truth was worth facing death for. That's why he's here now. Not because Sheriff Vickery captured him, but because he chose, finally chose, to stop running and face the system that wronged him. The evidence will show you Major Brennan's corruption. Witnesses will testify to it. Documents will prove it. And at the end of this trial, you'll have a choice just like Captain Mercer did. Believe the simple story that makes you comfortable, or accept the complicated truth that demands courage. I trust you'll choose courage. I trust you'll choose justice. Thank you. Garrett sat down and Grace felt tears on her cheeks. That was Luke's story. That was the truth. She watched the jury, trying to read their faces, trying to see if Garrett's words had landed. Some looked thoughtful. Some looked skeptical. All looked like they were settling in for a battle. Morrison's gavel fell. The prosecution may call its first witness. And the real fight began. Chase's first witness was an Army records clerk named Patterson, a nervous man with wire-rimmed glasses who shuffled papers like they might bite him. Chase led him through testimony, establishing the basics. Yes, Captain Mercer had been stationed at Fort Collins in 1870. Yes, he'd been under Major Brennan's command. Yes, there was an incident resulting in Brennan's death and Mercer's subsequent disappearance from custody. Patterson's voice droned on, laying foundation after foundation, each fact building toward the prosecution's narrative of desertion and murder. Garrett's cross-examination was brief and surgical. Mr. Patterson, in your review of Captain Mercer's service record, Did you find any disciplinary actions prior to Major Brennan's death? No, sir. Any complaints about his conduct? Any questions about his honor or integrity? No, sir. His record was exemplary. So in the 5 years Captain Mercer served before this incident, he was a model officer? Yes, sir. Yes. That's what the records show. Thank you. Nothing further. Chase stood quickly. Redirect, Your Honor. Mr. Patterson, does an exemplary record excuse desertion and murder? Objection. Garrett's voice was sharp. Calls for a legal conclusion the witness isn't qualified to make. Sustained. Rephrase, Mr. Chase. Chase smiled thinly. I'll withdraw the question. The jury can draw their own conclusions. The morning proceeded with methodical precision. Chase called the deputy who'd been present at Brennan's death scene, who testified about finding the major's body with a single gunshot wound to the chest. He called the doctor who'd examined the remains, who confirmed the wound would have been rapidly fatal. He called the officer who'd placed Mercer under arrest, who described how cooperative the captain had been initially, showing no signs of remorse or distress over having killed his commanding officer. With each witness, Chase painted the picture of a cold-blooded killing, a subordinate officer who'd murdered his superior and then fled when faced with consequences. Grace watched the jury absorbing this narrative, saw some of them nodding along, and felt her earlier optimism beginning to crack. During the lunch recess, Grace sat with Luke in a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom. A deputy stood by the door, giving them the illusion of privacy. Luke had barely touched the food Vickery had brought, his appetite lost to anxiety. Chase is good, Luke said quietly. He's making me look like a monster. Garrett hasn't presented our side yet. Wait until Martinez testifies. Wait until Winters tells them what really happened. Grace reached across the table to take his hand. The jury hasn't heard the whole story. What if the whole story isn't enough? Luke's voice was raw. What if they look at all the evidence and still decide I deserve to hang? Then we appeal. We fight. We don't give up. Grace squeezed his hand hard enough to hurt. You promised me you wouldn't give up, Luke Mercer. You promised. I'm trying, Grace. God knows I'm trying. But sitting in that courtroom, listening to Chase describe me like I'm some kind of cold-blooded killer, Luke's voice broke. That's not who I am. That's not what happened. But how do I prove it? How do I make them understand what it was like, facing Brennan with a gun in his hand, knowing he'd kill me to protect his secrets? You tell them the truth. When Garrett puts you on the stand, you look those jurors in the eye and you tell them exactly what happened. No embellishment, no excuses, just the truth. Grace brought his shackled hands to her lips, kissing his scarred knuckles. And I'll be right there, watching you, believing in you, loving you, no matter what they decide. The afternoon session began with the prosecution's key witness, Captain Thomas Ridley, who'd served as the investigating officer after Brennan's death. Ridley was in full dress uniform, his chest decorated with medals that caught the courtroom light. He was perhaps 50, with iron gray hair and the bearing of a man who'd never questioned authority in his life. Chase's examination was devastating. Ridley testified that Mercer had admitted to killing Brennan during his initial interrogation, claiming self-defense, but providing no evidence to support that claim. He described how Mercer's court-martial had been scheduled, how the defendant had been held in the stockade awaiting trial, and how he'd escaped during a prisoner transfer by overpowering 2 guards. Captain Ridley, Chase asked, in your investigation, did you find any evidence supporting Captain Mercer's claim that Major Brennan was corrupt? None whatsoever. Major Brennan's service record was distinguished. He'd served with honor for 15 years, received multiple commendations, was being considered for promotion to colonel. And the munitions reports that the defendant claims showed discrepancies. Did you examine those? I did. I found no irregularities. Everything was in order. Grace felt her stomach drop. She glanced at Garrett, who was scribbling notes furiously, his expression grim. This was bad. This was very bad. If the Army's own investigation had found no evidence of corruption, how could they prove it existed? Chase continued. Captain Ridley, in your professional opinion, was there any justification for Captain Mercer's actions? Objection. Calls for speculation. Garrett was on his feet. Your Honor, Captain Ridley conducted the official investigation. His opinion is relevant. Chase's voice was smooth. Overruled. The witness may answer. Ridley's response was measured and damning. No, sir, I found no justification whatsoever. Captain Mercer killed his commanding officer, then fled rather than face the consequences of his actions. In my opinion, this was murder followed by desertion. Nothing more, nothing less. Grace watched the jury. Several were nodding. One, the farmer named Brennan, looked personally offended as if Mercer's crimes were an insult to his own sense of order. Only the school teacher Aldridge maintained a neutral expression, his eyes thoughtful. Garrett's cross-examination began slowly, feeling out the witness's weaknesses. Captain Ridley, you testified that you found no irregularities in Major Brennan's munitions reports. How long did you spend examining those reports? I reviewed them thoroughly, spent several hours, to review 5 years of munitions management covering hundreds of transactions? Garrett's voice carried gentle skepticism. That seems rather quick for such a thorough investigation. I knew what to look for. The reports were in order, or they appeared to be in order to someone who wasn't looking too closely. Garrett paused. Captain Ridley, were you personal friends with Major Brennan? Ridley stiffened. We served together. We were colleagues. That's not what I asked. Were you friends? Yes. William Brennan was my friend. And when your friend was killed by a subordinate officer making accusations of corruption, did you approach that investigation with an open mind, or did you approach it determined to protect your friend's reputation? Objection! Chase was on his feet, argumentative and inflammatory. Sustained. Mr. Garrett, rephrase or move on. Captain Ridley, did you interview any of the enlisted men who worked directly with the munitions? The supply clerks, the inventory managers, the soldiers who might have noticed discrepancies? I interviewed several personnel. Did you interview Miguel Martinez, the supply clerk who worked most closely with Major Brennan's reports? Ridley hesitated, and Grace saw the tell, a slight tightening around his eyes. Mr. Martinez had been medically discharged by the time I began my investigation. Did you attempt to locate him, to interview him about potential irregularities? I didn't see the need. The reports were clearly in order. The reports you spent a few hours reviewing. Garrett's voice sharpened. Captain Ridley, isn't it true that the Army wanted this investigation concluded quickly? That the longer it took, the more questions people might ask about how a respected major ended up dead by his subordinate's hand? The investigation was thorough and professional. The investigation was designed to protect the institution, not uncover the truth. Garrett's words hung in the air. You found what you were supposed to find, a dead hero and a living scapegoat. Anything else would have required you to admit the Army's command structure was flawed, that corruption existed at high levels, that your friend wasn't the man you thought he was. So you didn't look too hard, did you, Captain? You found the easy answer and stopped searching. Objection. Your Honor, counsel is testifying rather than questioning. Chase's face was red with anger. Sustained, Mr. Garrett. Ask questions. I'm finished with this witness, Your Honor. Garrett returned to his seat, and Grace saw satisfaction in his expression despite the judge's rebuke. He'd planted doubt. That's all they needed, enough doubt to make the jury question whether the Army's investigation had been thorough or simply convenient. The prosecution rested late that afternoon. Morrison adjourned until morning, when the defense would present its case. Grace left the courthouse feeling battered but not broken. Chase had done damage, but Garrett had created cracks in the prosecution's narrative. Tomorrow they'd drive wedges into those cracks and hope the whole structure collapsed. That evening, Grace visited Luke in his cell. He looked exhausted, the day's testimony having taken its toll. She sat on the floor outside the bars, her back against the cold stone, and they talked about everything except the trial. They talked about the cabin, about whether they'd get a dog, about what they'd name those imaginary children. They built a future in words, brick by brick, as if speaking it aloud could make it real. Grace, Luke said eventually, his voice soft in the cell's dimness, if this goes wrong tomorrow, if the jury convicts, they won't. But if they do, Luke's hand found hers through the bars. I need you to know that these past weeks with you, they've been the best of my life. Better than I deserved. Better than I dared hope for. You gave me a reason to stop running, a reason to face this. No matter what happens tomorrow, you gave me that gift. Thank you. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. You're not saying goodbye. We're not doing this. I'm saying thank you. And I love you, and if I get the chance to keep loving you for the next 50 years, I'll spend every day grateful for that blizzard that brought us together. Luke's thumb traced circles on her palm. But if I don't get that chance, if tomorrow is the beginning of the end, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Go to California, find your sister. Let yourself heal and be happy. Don't spend your life mourning me the way I spent 8 years mourning Sarah and Lily. Promise me you'll live, Grace. Really live. I promise, Grace whispered, though she knew it was a lie. If Luke died, part of her would die too. But she'd tell him what he needed to hear, give him the peace of thinking she'd be all right. That's what love was sometimes, lying to spare the other person pain. They stayed like that until Vickery gently told Grace it was time to go. She kissed Luke through the bars, tasting salt and sorrow, and then walked back to the boarding house through streets that seemed darker than before. Tomorrow would bring their witnesses, their evidence, their last chance to prove the truth was stronger than convenient lies. Tomorrow would decide everything. Grace barely slept. She was awake before dawn, dressed and ready when Mrs. Chen knocked to say Garrett was downstairs wanting to go over her testimony. Grace found him in the parlor, looking like he hadn't slept either, his shirt wrinkled and his eyes shadowed. Martinez testifies first, Garrett said without preamble. I'll establish his credentials, introduce the documents, let him explain the discrepancies. Chase will attack his credibility, suggest he's lying to help his former commander. Then Winters. He'll corroborate Luke's version of events, admit he should have come forward sooner. Chase will destroy him for staying silent, try to make the jury think he's a coward covering for a friend. Then Father Benedict for character testimony. And finally, you. Me. You're our secret weapon, Grace. You didn't know Luke before the blizzard. You have no reason to lie for him. You're a widow who could have gone to California to safety but chose instead to fight for a man you barely knew because you saw something decent in him. The jury will listen to you. Garrett's voice was intense. I need you to tell them about the cabin, about Luke spending 5 days building you shelter when he could have kept running, about falling in love with a man who showed you what honor looks like even when it costs everything. Can you do that? Yes. Grace's voice was steady despite her fear. I'll tell them everything. The courtroom was even more packed when they arrived. Word had spread that the defense was presenting its case, and half of Carson Ridge seemed determined to witness it. Grace took her seat as Morrison called the court to order, and then Garrett stood to call his first witness. The defense calls Miguel Martinez. Martinez walked to the stand with dignity despite his missing hand, his shoulders squared like a soldier on parade. He swore his oath and settled into the witness chair, his eyes finding Luke's across the courtroom. Something passed between them, recognition, respect, shared history. Garrett's direct examination was methodical. He established Martinez's credentials as a supply clerk, his responsibility for maintaining munitions inventories, his proximity to Major Brennan's operations. Then he handed Martinez the leather folder containing the documents. Mr. Martinez, can you identify these documents? Yes, sir. These are copies of the actual munitions reports from Fort Collins between 1867 and 1870. I created the originals as part of my duties. And what do these reports show? Martinez took a breath. They show systematic theft. Major Brennan was reporting full inventories to his superiors while actually maintaining reduced stocks. The missing munitions, rifles, ammunition, even artillery shells were being sold. I couldn't prove to whom, but the pattern was consistent. Every few months, a large shipment would arrive, get logged officially, and then disappear from actual inventory while remaining on paper. The numbers never matched reality. Garrett handed the documents to the jury, letting them examine the entries Martinez had highlighted. Why didn't you report these discrepancies at the time? Fear, sir. Major Brennan was powerful. He had connections throughout the command structure. A supply clerk accusing a major of theft? I'd have been court-martialed myself, probably dishonorably discharged. So I kept copies and stayed quiet, telling myself someday someone would notice. Martinez's voice roughened with old shame. I was wrong to stay silent. Captain Mercer noticed. He came to me, asked questions about the reports. I confirmed his suspicions, and then he stopped, swallowed hard. Then he confronted Major Brennan, and everything went to hell. Did you witness that confrontation? No, sir, but I heard the gunshot. I was 2 buildings away working late. I heard raised voices, then a gunshot. By the time I got there, Major Brennan was dead and Captain Mercer was standing over him with a pistol, looking like his world had just ended. Did Captain Mercer say anything to you? He said, "He drew on me, Martinez. I didn't have a choice." Then the guards arrived and took him away. Martinez looked at Luke again. I should have testified at his court-martial, should have brought these documents forward, but I was a coward. I let an innocent man run rather than risk my own skin. I've regretted that every day for 8 years. Garrett let that admission hang in the air, genuine and damning and somehow redemptive. Then he returned to his seat. Your witness, Mr. Chase. Chase approached Martinez like a predator circling wounded prey. Mr. Martinez, you testified you've regretted staying silent for 8 years, yet you only came forward now when your former commanding officer is on trial for his life. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? I came forward because Mr. Garrett found me and asked me to tell the truth. Yes, I should have done it sooner, but better late than never. Or perhaps better late than never for Captain Mercer, who needs someone to corroborate his convenient story about corruption. Chase's voice was silky with insinuation. These documents you claim are copies from 8 years ago. Can you prove that? Can you prove you didn't create them last week to help your friend? They're genuine. But you can't prove it, can you? You kept them privately, maintained no chain of custody, can't produce anyone who saw you create them 8 years ago. For all this jury knows, you spent a few days with a pen and paper inventing evidence. Chase picked up the documents, holding them like they smelled bad. You say Major Brennan was corrupt, but Captain Ridley's investigation found no irregularities. The Army's official position is that Major Brennan was an honorable officer. Are you suggesting the Army lied? I'm suggesting they didn't look hard enough because they didn't want to find what was there. Martinez's voice strengthened. Sometimes truth is inconvenient, sir. Doesn't make it less true. How very philosophical. Chase's tone dripped contempt. Tell me, Mr. Martinez, how did you lose your hand? Martinez blinked at the change in direction. Training accident, sir. Misfire during artillery practice. And you received a medical discharge with pension benefits as a result. Yes, sir. Benefits that could be revoked if you were found to have falsified official military documents, correct? Objection! Garrett was on his feet. Relevance? Your Honor, goes to witness credibility and potential bias. Overruled. The witness may answer. Martinez's jaw set. I suppose they could revoke benefits for falsification, yes, but I didn't falsify anything. These documents are real. So you claim, but you're testifying here, accusing a dead war hero of corruption, supporting a deserter's murder defense, all while knowing that if anyone proves you're lying, you lose the pension that's probably your only income. Chase let that sink in. Sounds like you have quite a bit riding on this jury believing you, Mr. Martinez. I'm telling the truth. You're telling a story that benefits you and your former commander. That's not the same thing. Chase returned to his seat with theatrical dismissal. No further questions. Garrett stood for redirect. Mr. Martinez, are you being paid to testify today? No, sir. Has anyone promised you anything in exchange for your testimony? No, sir. I'm here because it's the right thing to do. Even though, as Mr. Chase pointed out, you risk your pension by accusing Major Brennan of corruption? Yes, sir. Even though. Thank you. Nothing further. Martinez left the stand and Grace saw from the jury's faces that they were divided. Some looked convinced by his testimony. Others looked skeptical, seeing a man with everything to gain from lying. The schoolteacher Aldridge was taking notes, his expression unreadable. Garrett called Sergeant Tom Winters next. Winters walked to the stand with military bearing, but Grace could see the nervousness in his eyes. This was the testimony that could break their case or make it, the corroboration they desperately needed. Garrett led him through his credentials, 22 years in the Army, decorated veteran, currently serving at Fort Mason. Then he moved to the critical questions. Sergeant Winters, did you serve under Major Brennan at Fort Collins? Yes, sir, for 3 years. And during that time, did you have occasion to observe Major Brennan's handling of munitions and supplies? Winters' voice was steady but strained. Yes, sir. I noticed discrepancies between reported inventory and actual stores, raised concerns to Captain Mercer. What did Captain Mercer do? He investigated, quietly, because accusing a major of theft without proof could end a career. He reviewed the reports, talked to Martinez, tried to build a case. Winters paused. Then one night he confronted Major Brennan directly. I was in the next building. I heard them arguing, voices raised, accusations flying. Then a gunshot. The courtroom was silent. Every eye was on Winters. What happened after you heard the gunshot? I ran to Major Brennan's quarters, found Captain Mercer standing there with his service pistol, Major Brennan on the floor. The Major's pistol was on the ground near his hand, like he'd drawn it and dropped it when he was hit. Winters' voice roughened. Captain Mercer looked at me and said, He was going to kill me, Tom. I didn't have a choice. And I believed him. I believe him still. Why didn't you testify to this at Captain Mercer's court-martial? This was the moment Grace had been dreading. Winters' face worked with emotion. Because I was a coward. Because I had a wife and kids who depended on my army salary. Because speaking against Major Brennan meant facing down the entire command structure that wanted this case closed quietly. So I stayed silent. Told myself the truth would come out without my help. But it didn't. Captain Mercer ran, and I let him, and I've carried that guilt every day since. Garrett let the admission breathe. Sergeant Winters, are you lying now to ease that guilt? No, sir. I'm telling the truth I should have told 8 years ago. Major Brennan drew his weapon first. Captain Mercer defended himself. That's what happened. Thank you, Sergeant. Your witness. Chase rose with the expression of a man about to enjoy himself. Sergeant Winters, you just admitted to being a coward who stayed silent while an innocent man fled. Why should this jury believe you're suddenly brave enough to tell the truth now? Because I'm tired of living with the lie. Or because your former commanding officer is facing the noose and you want to save him. Chase's voice was sharp. You served under Captain Mercer for 3 years. You respected him, perhaps even admired him. You'd do anything to help him, wouldn't you? I'd tell the truth to help him. That's what I'm doing. The truth as you conveniently remember it 8 years later. Chase paced in front of the witness stand. Sergeant, you testified you heard an argument followed by a gunshot. How do you know Major Brennan drew his weapon first? Were you in the room? No, but... So you didn't actually see what happened. You're speculating based on the position of a pistol on the floor, a pistol that could have been placed there after the fact. You're taking Captain Mercer's word for what occurred. I know the captain. He wouldn't lie. You knew the captain. 8 years ago, before he became a fugitive living in the wilderness. People change, Sergeant, especially when they're desperate. Chase leaned in. Isn't it possible that Captain Mercer shot Major Brennan in anger over being investigated for his accusations? That he then staged the scene to look like self-defense? No, that's not what happened. But you didn't see what happened. You only saw the aftermath. And you're asking this jury to convict a dead war hero of corruption and theft based on your speculation and a convenient story. Chase's voice rose with righteous indignation. You stayed silent for 8 years when your testimony might have mattered. Now you come forward when it's safe, when the Army can't punish you for questioning a major's integrity because that major's been dead nearly a decade. That's not courage, Sergeant. That's cowardice looking for redemption. Winters' face had gone pale. I'm telling the truth. You're telling a version of events that makes you feel better about your own failures. That's not the same thing. Chase returned to his seat. No further questions. Garrett did what he could on redirect, but the damage was done. Winters left the stand looking smaller than when he'd entered it, and Grace saw several jurors shaking their heads. Chase had successfully painted him as a coward desperate for redemption, willing to lie to ease his conscience. The testimony that should have saved Luke might have condemned him instead. Father Benedict provided some relief. The elderly chaplain testified about Luke's character, about his integrity and honor as an officer, about the impossible position he'd been placed in when confronted with corruption from above. Chase's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. It's hard to attack a priest's credibility, and Chase was smart enough not to try too hard, but character testimony alone wouldn't save Luke. The jury needed more than nice words about a defendant's soul. Then Garrett called Grace to the stand. She walked forward on legs that felt like water, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. She swore her oath with a hand that trembled, settled into the witness chair, and found Luke's eyes across the courtroom. He was watching her with an expression that made her want to cry, hope and fear and love all tangled together. Garrett's voice was gentle. "Miss Holloway, please tell the jury how you met Captain Mercer." Grace took a breath and began to speak. She told them about the blizzard, about dying in a frozen wagon, about a rough voice calling through the storm, asking if anyone was alive. She described giving her last piece of bread to a stranger who looked like he'd been running from ghosts. She told them about waking to find Luke felling trees, about his confession that he was building her a cabin because she'd reminded him what it felt like to be human. "Why did he say he was building you a cabin?" Garrett asked. "He told me his wife and daughter had frozen to death in a wagon 7 winters before, that no one had stopped to help them. He said I'd given him shelter when I didn't have to, and he wanted to repay the world for what it had failed to give his family." Grace's voice cracked. "He said he wouldn't let another woman die because of him." "Did he tell you about Major Brennan? About why he'd been running?" "Yes. He told me he'd killed his commanding officer in self-defense, that the officer had been corrupt and dangerous. He said the army wanted to hang him not for defending himself, but for embarrassing the institution." Grace looked at the jury. "He could have lied. Could have pretended to be someone innocent, someone without blood on his hands. But he told me the truth because that's who he is, a man who faces hard things honestly." Garrett walked her through the rest, the cabin rising log by log, falling in love with a man who'd forgotten how to believe in his own worth, choosing to come to Carson Ridge and fight for him rather than let him face judgment alone. Grace spoke from the heart, no rehearsal or artifice, just the raw truth of what Luke Mercer meant to her. "Miss Holloway," Garrett said finally, "you didn't know Captain Mercer before that blizzard. You had no obligation to him. Why are you here, risking your own reputation to testify on his behalf?" Grace looked at Luke, then back at the jury. "Because he's a good man who made an impossible choice and has been punishing himself for it ever since. Because in 5 days he showed me more integrity and kindness than most people show in a lifetime. Because I love him, and love means fighting for someone even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Tears were streaming down her face now, unchecked. "He built me a home when I had nothing. The least I can do is help him keep his life." "Thank you. No further questions." Chase approached her like she was something fragile that needed gentle handling, which made Grace immediately suspicious. His voice when he spoke was soft, almost sympathetic. "Miss Holloway, you suffered a terrible loss when your husband died. You were grieving, alone, facing death in a blizzard. That must have been terrifying." "It was." "And then Captain Mercer appeared, saved you, built you shelter, gave you hope when you had none." Chase's tone was understanding. "In that vulnerable state, is it possible you developed feelings for him not because of who he truly is, but because of what he represented? Safety, protection, a reason to keep living?" Grace saw the trap. "No, I fell in love with Luke because of who he is, not what he represents." "But Miss Holloway, you admit you barely knew him. 5 days of working together, hearing his version of events with no way to verify them. Isn't it possible you're here not because you know he's innocent, but because you desperately want him to be? Because accepting his guilt would mean accepting you fell in love with a murderer?" "Objection!" Garrett was on his feet, argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence. "Sustained. Mr. Chase asked questions." Chase's expression remained gentle. "Miss Holloway, has Captain Mercer told you he loves you?" Grace hesitated, sensing danger but unable to see where it was coming from. "Yes." "And you believe him?" "Yes." "Just as you believe his story about Major Brennan being corrupt? About killing in self-defense?" Chase's voice sharpened slightly. "You believe everything he tells you because you're in love with him. Because questioning him means questioning your own judgment. But this jury can't afford to take things on faith the way you do. They need evidence, not emotion. And the evidence shows a deserter who killed his commanding officer and ran for 8 years. Your love story is touching, Miss Holloway, but it's not a defense to murder." Grace felt tears of frustration burning. "He's not a murderer. He's a good man who was put in an impossible position by his own actions. He chose to confront Major Brennan. He chose to kill him. He chose to run. Those were his choices, not circumstances forced upon him." Chase's voice carried finality. You want desperately to believe he's innocent because the alternative is unbearable, but wanting something doesn't make it true. No further questions. Grace left the stand feeling like she'd failed, like her testimony had hurt more than helped. Garrett squeezed her shoulder as she passed, but she could see worry in his eyes. She returned to her seat behind Luke, her hands shaking, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Luke turned as much as his shackles allowed. "Don't be. You told the truth. That's all anyone can ask." Garrett stood one more time. "Your Honor, the defense calls Captain Luke Mercer." The courtroom stirred with anticipation as Luke rose and walked to the stand. His shackles clinked with each step, a reminder of his current status. He swore his oath, settled into the chair Grace had just vacated, and faced the jury that would decide his fate. His expression was calm, almost serene, like a man who'd finally stopped running and was ready to face whatever came. Garrett's direct examination was straightforward. Luke described his service record, his relationship with Major Brennan, his growing suspicions about the munitions discrepancies. He spoke clearly and without embellishment, each answer measured and honest. "Captain Mercer, tell the jury what happened the night Major Brennan died." Luke took a breath. "I'd gathered enough evidence to confirm what Martinez and Winters had been telling me. Major Brennan was systematically stealing from the Army and selling weapons to hostile forces. I knew I had to confront him, give him a chance to come clean before I took it up the chain of command. So I went to his quarters and told him I knew what he'd been doing." What was his reaction? Rage. He demanded I hand over any evidence I'd collected, said I was finished in the Army, that he'd destroy my career. I told him he could either confess or I'd report him to the colonel. Then he went for his pistol. Luke's voice steadied. I saw his hand move to his weapon, and I drew mine. I was faster. I shot him before he could shoot me. You're certain he was reaching for his weapon? I'm certain. I was facing him, watching his hands. He went for his gun with the clear intent to use it. Luke met Garrett's eyes. If I'd hesitated, if I'd given him the benefit of the doubt, I'd be dead and his corruption would have continued. I had seconds to choose between dying to protect protocol or living to tell the truth. I chose to live. Why did you run after you were arrested? Because I knew the Army wouldn't believe me. They'd already started the narrative. Good major killed by insubordinate captain. The investigation was a formality before the hanging. My court-martial was scheduled before I even had counsel. I heard guards talking about the rope, about how quickly they could expedite the process. Luke's jaw clenched. I know running made me look guilty, but staying meant dying silent. I chose to live, even if it meant living with everyone thinking I was a coward and a murderer. Do you regret that choice? Luke was quiet for a moment. I regret that I didn't trust the system to find the truth. I regret the years I spent hiding. But I don't regret surviving, and I don't regret meeting Grace, who gave me a reason to stop running and face this. He looked at her. Whatever happens here, I made the right choice that night. I'd make it again. Garrett sat down, and Chase rose. Grace braced herself for a brutal cross-examination, but Chase surprised her by starting gently, almost conversationally. Captain Mercer, you've painted quite a picture. Corrupt major, noble subordinate, tragic misunderstanding. It's compelling. But let's talk about facts. You admit you shot Major Brennan. Yes? You admit you were alone with him when it happened. Yes. You admit you're the only living person who knows whether Major Brennan actually drew his weapon first. Luke hesitated. Winters heard the confrontation. Sergeant Winters heard voices and a gunshot. He didn't see what happened. So again, you're the only living person who actually knows whether this was murder or self-defense. Correct? Correct. How convenient for you. Chase's voice hardened. Captain Mercer, you've had 8 years to perfect this story. 8 years to figure out exactly what to say to make yourself look innocent. How do we know any of it is true? Because it is true. I have no reason to lie. You have every reason to lie. You're on trial for your life. You'll say anything to avoid the noose. Chase paced in front of the witness stand. Let's talk about these alleged munitions discrepancies. Captain Ridley investigated and found nothing. The Army's official position is that Major Brennan was honorable. You're asking this jury to believe that you, a junior officer, uncovered a massive corruption scheme that a formal investigation missed. Doesn't that strike you as unlikely? The investigation didn't miss it. They ignored it because admitting Brennan was corrupt would embarrass the institution. Or maybe there was no corruption. Maybe you killed your commanding officer for reasons you don't want to admit. Professional rivalry, personal animosity, anger over a reprimand, and then concocted this elaborate story to justify murder. Chase's voice rose. You're asking us to believe a distinguished major with 15 years of service was a thief and a traitor, based solely on your word and some documents a one-handed clerk claims are authentic. That's not evidence, Captain. That's a fairy tale. Luke's hands clenched on the witness stand arms. It's the truth. The truth, according to a man who fled rather than face justice. A man who chose cowardice over honor. A man who... Chase paused dramatically. Who stands here in shackles asking us to trust him after he spent 8 years proving he can't be trusted. I ran because staying meant dying for something I didn't do. You don't know that. You assumed you'd be convicted, assumed the system was rigged, assumed no one would believe you, but you never gave the truth a chance. You just ran. Chase leaned in close. And now you're asking this jury to give you the benefit of the doubt you never gave to the Army, to believe you when you've proven yourself unworthy of belief. Why should they? Luke looked at the prosecutor, then at the jury, then at Grace. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. Because running was wrong. Staying silent was wrong. But killing Brennan to save my own life wasn't wrong. And I'm done living like it was. If this jury decides I deserve to hang for defending myself, so be it. But I won't lie about what happened to make myself more palatable. Brennan was corrupt. He drew on me. I shot him. I ran because I was scared. And now I'm here, facing what I should have faced 8 years ago. That's the truth. Believe it or don't, but it won't change by morning. Chase studied him for a long moment, then turned away. No further questions. Garrett had no redirect. Luke left the stand and returned to his seat, and Grace reached forward to grip his shoulder. He covered her hand with his, and they sat like that while Garrett and Chase delivered their closing arguments. Garrett spoke of impossible choices and corrupt systems, of a good man driven to desperate measures, of evidence that proved corruption even if the jury didn't want to believe a war hero could fall so far. His voice carried passion and conviction, painting Luke as a tragic figure caught in circumstances beyond his control. Chase spoke of facts and evidence, of desertion and murder dressed up in convenient excuses. He reminded the jury that their job wasn't to like the defendant or sympathize with his story, but to apply the law to the facts. And the facts, he said, were clear. Luke Mercer killed his commanding officer and ran. Everything else was distraction. Morrison gave the jury their instructions, explaining reasonable doubt and the elements of each charge. Then the 12 men filed out to deliberate, and the courtroom emptied slowly, people heading home or to saloons to discuss the case while they waited for a verdict. Grace and Luke were given a few minutes alone in the holding room. They sat across from each other, hands clasped, no more words left except the ones that mattered. Whatever they decide, Luke said, I love you. I'll always love you. They're going to acquit you. They have to. But Grace's voice lacked conviction. She'd seen the jury's faces. She'd heard Chase's arguments. They had doubt, yes, but did they have enough doubt to overcome desertion and murder? Grace, Luke squeezed her hands. Look at me. Whatever happens, you gave me the greatest gift. You made me want to live again. You made me believe I deserved a future. That's more than I ever expected. Don't talk like this is goodbye, and it might be. I need to prepare you for that. Luke's eyes were bright with tears. If they convict, I need you to remember what I said about California, about finding your sister, about living. I can't. You can. You will. Because you're stronger than you know, stronger than I ever was. Luke brought her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles. And if somehow they acquit, if somehow we get our miracle, then we go back to that cabin and we build the life we've been dreaming about. Either way, Grace Holloway, you changed my world. Vickery appeared at the door. Time's up. Jury's asking for evidence. Could be a while. They parted with one last kiss, Grace tasting her own tears, and then she was back in the courtroom waiting. Hours passed. The afternoon sun crossed the sky and began its descent toward the mountains. People came and went, speculating on what was taking so long. A quick deliberation usually meant conviction, but a long one? That could mean anything. Dinner time came and went. Grace sat in the front row, unable to eat, unable to move, just waiting. Mrs. Chen brought her tea that she didn't drink. Garrett paced near the defense table, his expression unreadable. Chase looked confident, occasionally checking his pocket watch like he had somewhere better to be. Finally, as dusk began to paint the courtroom shadows long, the bailiff announced the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled rapidly, word spreading through Carson Ridge like wildfire. Luke was brought back in shackles, taking his place at the defense table. Grace watched his face, trying to read his thoughts, but he looked calm, eerily calm, like a man who'd made peace with whatever was coming. The jury filed in, taking their seats with expressions Grace couldn't decipher. Morrison called the court to order, and the foreman, the merchant Holloway, stood with a piece of paper in his hands. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Morrison's voice seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of desertion, how do you find?" Grace held her breath. Luke didn't move. The courtroom was absolutely silent, every eye on the foreman's lips. "Guilty." The word hit Grace like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs, felt the courtroom tilt around her. Luke's shoulders sagged slightly, but he didn't look surprised. Garrett's jaw clenched, his hand gripping the table edge hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Morrison's voice cut through Grace's shock. "On the charge of murder, how do you find?" The foreman looked at the paper again, then at Luke. The pause felt infinite, stretching into forever. Grace's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. "Not guilty." Grace's sob of relief was audible across the courtroom. Luke's head dropped forward, his hands covering his face. Garrett exhaled shakily, gripping Luke's shoulder. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some disappointed, some satisfied, all surprised by the split verdict. Morrison's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order! I will have order in this court." The room quieted reluctantly. The judge looked at the jury foreman. "Let me be clear. The jury finds the defendant guilty of desertion, but not guilty of murder. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. We believe Captain Mercer killed Major Brennan in self-defense, but we can't excuse his decision to flee rather than face trial. The evidence of desertion was clear." Morrison nodded slowly, then turned to Luke. "Captain Mercer, please rise." Luke stood, his legs unsteady. Grace could see him trembling, fighting to maintain his composure. Garrett stood beside him, one hand still on his shoulder. "The jury has found you not guilty of murder," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "They've accepted your claim of self-defense, believed your testimony about Major Brennan's corruption. That's no small thing, Captain. You've cleared your name of the most serious charge." He paused, and Grace felt her heart sink at what was coming. "However, you've been found guilty of desertion. You abandoned your post, fled from custody, and spent 8 years evading military justice. Those actions cannot be dismissed simply because you were afraid of an unjust outcome." Luke's voice was steady when he spoke. "I understand, Your Honor. Ordinarily, desertion carries severe penalties. In wartime, it can mean death. In peacetime, lengthy imprisonment and dishonorable discharge." Morrison removed his spectacles, cleaning them slowly while the courtroom held its breath. "But these are not ordinary circumstances. You fled because you had reason to believe the system would fail you, and given Captain Ridley's testimony about his cursory investigation, you may well have been right. The Army failed you, Captain Mercer, just as you failed the Army by not trusting it to find the truth." Morrison replaced his spectacles and looked at Luke with eyes that had seen too many good men broken by impossible choices. "I'm going to do something unusual. The court finds that the 8 years you've already served, living as a fugitive, denying yourself human connection, punishing yourself for survival, constitute time served for your desertion. You are hereby sentenced to the 8 years already endured, with credit for time served. Effective immediately, you are free to go." The courtroom exploded. Grace heard nothing over the roaring in her ears, saw nothing but Luke turning toward her with an expression of stunned disbelief. Morrison's gavel cracked again and again, demanding order, but it took several minutes for the chaos to subside. "However, Morrison continued once he could be heard. There are conditions. You will remain on probation for 2 years. You will report quarterly to Sheriff Vickery or his designated representative. You will maintain lawful employment and residence. And Captain Mercer, Morrison's voice softened slightly, you will stop running. You will live like a man who deserves the freedom he's been given. Do you understand these terms? Yes, Your Honor. Luke's voice cracked. Thank you. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank the jury who believed you, the lawyer who fought for you, and the woman behind you who never stopped having faith. Morrison looked at Grace, and something like approval crossed his weathered face. Deputy, remove the defendant's shackles. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell one final time, and then Luke was free. The shackles came off with metallic clicks that sounded like church bells to Grace's ears. Luke turned, and she was there, throwing herself into his arms with a force that nearly knocked them both over. He caught her, held her, buried his face in her hair, and shook with sobs he'd been holding back for 8 years. We won, Grace whispered against his chest. We won, Luke. You're free. Not guilty, Luke managed through his tears. They believed me. They actually believed me. People pressed around them, Garrett shaking Luke's hand and grinning like he'd just won the lottery, Vickery offering quiet congratulations, Martinez and Winters both looking vindicated despite Chase's attempts to destroy their credibility. Even some of the jurors approached, the school teacher Aldridge explaining that they'd deliberated for hours, that the desertion charge had been contentious but ultimately unavoidable given Luke's admitted flight, but that every single juror had believed his account of Brennan's corruption and the self-defense shooting. You're a good man who made a bad choice in circumstances designed to break you, Aldridge said, shaking Luke's hand. Don't waste this second chance. I won't, sir. I swear it. Chase left without a word, his expression unreadable. He'd won on desertion but lost on murder, a prosecutor's nightmare, neither full victory nor complete defeat. Grace didn't spare him much thought. She was too busy holding Luke, convincing herself he was real and free, and hers. Mrs. Chen appeared with a basket of food, insisting they needed to eat after such an ordeal. Father Benedict offered a blessing that made Grace cry all over again. Even some of the townspeople who'd been hungry for a hanging seemed moved by the verdict, approaching with cautious congratulations and apologies for their earlier bloodthirst. As the courthouse finally emptied and evening settled over Carson Ridge, Luke and Grace found themselves alone on the courthouse steps. The town stretched before them, lamp-lit windows beginning to glow in the dusk. Somewhere in those mountains beyond town, their cabin waited. I can't believe it's over, Luke said quietly. 8 years of running, 8 years of hiding, and it's just over. Not over. Beginning. Grace laced her fingers through his. We can go home now, Luke. Really home. Home. Luke tested the word like he'd forgotten how it tasted. That cabin in the mountains, Mercer and Holloway above the door. Unless you'd prefer Holloway and Mercer. Luke laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. I'd prefer just Mercer, actually, if you'd consider making that official. Grace's breath caught. Is this? I don't have a ring, don't have anything except 8 years of bad choices and a half-built cabin in the middle of nowhere. Luke turned to face her fully, taking both her hands. But Grace Holloway, you saved my life in more ways than one. You gave me a reason to stop running, a reason to face my demons, a reason to believe I deserved tomorrow. Would you consider spending all your tomorrows with me? As my wife? Grace was crying again, but this time from joy so pure it hurt. Yes, of course, yes. I've been yours since you started building me a home, Luke Mercer. Took you long enough to make it official. He kissed her then, right there on the courthouse steps with half of Carson Ridge probably watching from windows, and Grace didn't care. She kissed him back with everything she had, all the fear and hope and love she'd been carrying since that blizzard brought them together. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and grinning like fools. We should get married tomorrow, Luke said, before something else goes wrong, before the universe decides we've had enough happiness. Tomorrow? Grace laughed. Luke, we need to arrange things, find a minister, get a license. Father Benedict is right over there, probably still in the church. We can get a license from the county clerk first thing in the morning. Vickery and Mrs. Chen can witness. Luke's voice carried an urgency Grace understood. He'd spent 8 years with nothing permanent, nothing certain, and now he wanted to lock this down before fate could intervene. Please, Grace, I've waited 8 years to stop living like I'm already dead. Don't make me wait any longer to start living right. Grace saw the need in his eyes, the desperate hunger for something official and binding and real. All right, tomorrow. We'll figure out the details tonight and get married tomorrow. They walked to the church hand in hand, finding Father Benedict organizing hymnals in the sanctuary. The old priest looked up at their entrance, saw their joined hands and luminous expressions, and smiled like he'd been expecting them. I suppose you two would like to discuss marriage, he said without preamble. Tomorrow, if possible, Father. Luke's voice was respectful but firm. I know it's sudden, but, son, I've been a priest for 40 years. I know love when I see it, and I know urgency when I hear it. Tomorrow is fine. Come by at noon. Bring your witnesses. Wear something nice. Father Benedict's smile widened. And Captain Mercer? Congratulations on your verdict. Justice doesn't always wear the prettiest face, but today she smiled on you. Thank you, Father, for everything. They left the church and walked back to Mrs. Chen's boarding house, where the proprietor took one look at them and immediately began planning. Wedding tomorrow? Okay. I make dress for Grace. I have silk, very pretty. Luke, you need good shirt, good pants. I have son's clothes, never worn, you same size probably, and food. We have celebration dinner after ceremony. You pay me later after you rich from cabin business or something. Mrs. Chen, you don't have to, Grace began. Yes, I do. You good people. You fight for truth, for love, for each other. That deserves celebration. Mrs. Chen shooed them toward the stairs. Now go, rest. Tomorrow is big day. You need sleep, need strength for being married people. Grace collapsed into her rented room with the surreal feeling that her entire life had transformed in a single day. This morning, Luke had been on trial for his life. Tonight he was free and they were engaged. Tomorrow they'd be married. It felt like a fever dream, too good to be true, the kind of ending you read in storybooks but never expected in real life. Luke was given a room down the hall. Mrs. Chen had standards about unmarried couples, trial verdict or no, but he knocked on Grace's door an hour later, unable to stay away. They sat on her bed, backs against the wall, shoulders touching, and talked about everything and nothing until exhaustion finally pulled them towards sleep. Grace? Luke's voice was soft in the darkness. I'm terrified. Grace turned to look at him, seeing vulnerability in his face. Of what? Of waking up and discovering this was a dream, that I'm still in that cell, still waiting for a verdict that ends with a noose, that you were just something my desperate brain invented to make dying easier. Luke's hand found hers. Tell me this is real. Tell me tomorrow I'm actually marrying you. This is real. Grace squeezed his hand hard. Tomorrow, you're marrying me. And the day after that, we're going home to that cabin. And the day after that, we're starting the life we built in promises and timber. I swear it, Luke. This is real. He pulled her close, and they fell asleep like that, fully clothed and tangled together, two people who'd survived impossible odds and were finally allowed to rest. Morning came with sunshine and birdsong. Grace woke to find Luke already gone, presumably chased back to his own room by Mrs. Chen's propriety, and for a moment panic seized her. Then she saw the note on her bedside table in Luke's rough handwriting, getting marriage license, back soon, not running this time, I promise. Love, Luke. Grace smiled and got up to face her wedding day. Mrs. Chen appeared with breakfast in the promised silk dress, a simple but elegant cream-colored gown that fit Grace surprisingly well. My daughter's, Mrs. Chen explained. She married 5 years ago, moved to San Francisco. She not need any more. You borrow, bring good luck. It's beautiful. Thank you. Grace touched the silk reverently. This was happening. She was really getting married today. Luke returned mid-morning with the marriage license and a bouquet of wildflowers he'd clearly picked himself, frost-damaged and half-dead from the winter cold, but chosen with care. They're not much, he said sheepishly, but everything in town is closed for winter and I wanted you to have flowers. They're perfect. Grace took the bouquet and kissed him. You're perfect. Now go get ready. Mrs. Chen has clothes for you. Noon approached with agonizing slowness. Grace dressed in the silk gown, pinned her hair up with trembling fingers, and studied herself in the small mirror. She looked happy, radiant even, in a way she hadn't been since Thomas died. The thought of her first husband brought a pang of guilt, but then she remembered what Thomas had told her once. If I die first, don't you dare spend your life in mourning. Find someone good and love them hard. She was doing that. Thomas would approve. Father Benedict's church was small but lovely, the winter light streaming through stained glass windows painting rainbow patterns on the worn wooden pews. Luke waited at the altar in clothes that were slightly too big but clean and respectable, his hair combed and beard trimmed. He looked nervous and young and so full of hope it made Grace's heart ache. Mrs. Chen and Sheriff Vickery served as witnesses, along with Samuel Garrett, who'd insisted on attending. Martinez and Winters had left town that morning, their testimony complete, but they'd left notes wishing Luke and Grace well. Even a few townspeople filtered in, drawn by curiosity or genuine goodwill. Father Benedict smiled at them from his position before the altar. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Luke Mercer and Grace Holloway, two souls who found each other in a blizzard and chose to build something beautiful from survival. Marriage is not merely the joining of two people, but the creation of a new life together, a life that requires courage, faith, and the willingness to face whatever storms may come. Luke, Grace, you've already proven you have these qualities. Now you'll prove them again every day in the small choices and large promises that make a marriage strong. The ceremony was simple and brief. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, Luke promising to build Grace a life as sturdy as the cabin they'd created together, Grace promising to never let Luke forget he was worth loving. Father Benedict blessed their union with words about mercy and second chances and the redemptive power of love. Then he pronounced them husband and wife, and Luke kissed his bride like she was air and he was drowning. The small congregation applauded. Mrs. Chen cried openly. Vickery clapped Luke on the back and told him he'd better live up to those vows or answer to the sheriff. Garrett handed them an envelope containing what he called his wedding gift, a partial refund of his legal fees because defending the innocent shouldn't bankrupt them. The celebration dinner at Mrs. Chen's was modest but joyful, roasted chicken and vegetables, rice cooked perfectly, and a small cake the proprietor had somehow managed to make overnight. They ate and drank and laughed, and for a few hours the world seemed full of nothing but possibility. As evening approached, Luke and Grace said their goodbyes. They'd be leaving for the cabin at first light, eager to return to the home that had started everything. Mrs. Chen hugged them both, making them promise to visit. Vickery reminded Luke about his quarterly check-ins and told him he'd better not make the sheriff regret vouching for his character. Garrett simply shook their hands and wished them well, looking satisfied with the job well done. Finally, in their separate rooms one last night before they could properly share a bed as husband and wife, Luke and Grace prepared for the journey ahead. Grace packed her few belongings, including Thomas's pocket watch, which she wrapped carefully and placed at the bottom of her bag. Thomas was her past, and she would always honor what they'd shared. But Luke was her future, and she was ready to embrace it fully. They left Carson Ridge at dawn, riding the horses Vickery had loaned them, with promises to return the animals once they were settled. The journey back to the cabin took 2 days, retracing the path they'd taken to trial, but this time with hope instead of dread weighing their saddlebags. They camped one night beneath stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and Luke held Grace in his arms and whispered about all the tomorrows they'd been given. When the cabin finally came into view through the trees, Grace felt tears burning. It stood exactly as they'd left it, solid and waiting, their names still carved above the door. Home. They dismounted and stood for a moment just looking at it, this structure they'd built with bleeding hands and desperate hope. Then Luke swept Grace up in his arms and carried her across the threshold, making her laugh and cry at the same time. "Welcome home, Mrs. Mercer," he said, setting her down gently. "Welcome home, Mr. Mercer." Grace looked around at the single room they'd created, empty of furniture except for the bed frame and table Luke had built, but full of potential. "It needs work. It needs life." Luke pulled her close. "We'll give it that. Starting now." That first week back at the cabin passed in a blur of activity and joy. Luke built shelves and chairs, fashioned hooks for hanging coats and pots. Grace unpacked their meager supplies and began planning the garden she'd plant come spring. They fell into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient, working together during the day, falling into bed exhausted at night, waking to do it all again. Luke rode to the nearest settlement twice that first month to report to Vickery's designated deputy and to buy supplies. Each time he returned, Grace saw the relief in his eyes. He'd been afraid, she realized, that leaving the cabin would somehow break the spell, that the law would change its mind and take him away again. But it didn't. The world kept turning and they kept living, and slowly Luke began to believe this was real and permanent. Winter gradually loosened its grip. The snow melted into spring mud. The creek thawed and began to run with icy mountain water, and the first green shoots appeared where Grace had planted her garden. She'd bought seeds with money from her dwindling savings, tomatoes and beans, carrots and squash, practical things that would help them survive, but also hopeful things like flowers, because beauty mattered too. They acquired chickens from a homesteader 10 miles north, 6 hens and a rooster who Luke immediately named Sergeant because of his aggressive morning wake-up calls. The birds provided eggs and entertainment, scratching in the dirt near the cabin and occasionally trying to sneak inside to investigate. Luke built a smokehouse for preserving meat and fish from the creek. Grace sewed curtains from fabric she'd bought in town, blue like she'd always planned, and hung them in the windows. The cabin transformed from shelter to home, filled with small touches that made it uniquely theirs. 3 months after the trial, Grace realized her monthly courses hadn't come. She waited another week to be sure, then waited another week because hope was terrifying. And finally, she told Luke one evening as they sat on the porch he'd built facing the sunrise. "I'm pregnant." Luke went very still. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor, but yes, I'm certain." Grace watched his face, trying to read his reaction. "How do you feel about that?" Luke's answer came in the form of a whoop of joy so loud it startled the chickens and sent them squawking into the trees. He picked Grace up and spun her around, laughing and crying at the same time, and Grace found herself laughing too, caught up in his infectious delight. "We're having a baby," Luke kept saying, like he couldn't quite believe it. "Grace, we're having a baby, a real baby, our baby." "Yes, we are. Sometime in late fall, I think, November or December." Grace cupped his face in her hands. "Are you ready for this? For diapers and sleepless nights and a tiny person who'll need everything from us?" "I've been ready since you first told me about those imaginary children we'd have, since you made me believe in a future worth living for." Luke's voice was thick with emotion. "This baby is proof that good things can grow from hard choices, that love can survive anything, that we're building something that lasts." They visited the nearest town, a settlement called Timber Falls about 15 miles away, and saw the only doctor within 50 miles. Dr. Sarah Brennan, no relation to the major, she assured them with a knowing look, confirmed Grace's pregnancy and pronounced her healthy. She also raised an eyebrow at Grace's last name. "Mercer? Any relation to the captain who got tried in Carson Ridge last winter?" "I'm his wife," Grace said, lifting her chin slightly. Dr. Brennan studied them both, then smiled. "Good for him. Good for both of you." That verdict was the talk of the territory for months. Most folks agreed justice was served, even if it didn't look pretty. She turned her attention back to Grace's examination. "Come see me monthly. I'll want to monitor your progress. And if you go into labor early, or anything feels wrong, send your husband for me immediately. Understood?" They understood. They rode back to the cabin with Grace's hand resting on her still flat stomach, already imagining the child growing there. They talked about names, Lily if a girl, to honor Luke's lost daughter, but maybe something else if Grace preferred. Thomas if a boy, to honor her first husband, unless Luke would rather choose something new, something that belonged only to them. "Hope," Grace said suddenly. "If it's a girl, Hope Mercer, because that's what you gave me. What we gave each other." "Hope," Luke repeated, testing it out. "I like that. And if it's a boy?" "James, my father's name. He died when I was young, but I remember him as good and strong and kind, like you." "Hope or James Mercer," Luke smiled. "Either way, this baby's going to be loved beyond measure." Summer arrived in full force. bringing heat and work and abundance. Grace's garden flourished under her careful tending, producing more vegetables than they could eat. Luke taught himself to preserve and can food for winter. Working beside Grace in the kitchen, they'd expanded to include a proper stove he'd bought with money, earned from selling furs in Timber Falls. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Grace's belly swelled with new life, and Luke spent evenings with his hand pressed against her stomach, feeling their baby kick. He built a cradle from pine, carved with careful attention to detail, and placed it near their bed. Grace sewed tiny clothes and blankets, preparing for the arrival she both anticipated and feared. "What if I'm a terrible mother?" she asked Luke one night as summer faded into autumn. "What if I don't know what to do?" "Then you'll learn. Same way I'll learn to be a father. Same way we learned to build this cabin and survive in these mountains." Luke kissed her forehead. "We'll figure it out together, Grace. That's what we do." October brought the first snow, dusting the mountains white and reminding them that winter was coming again. Grace was huge now, moving carefully, her back aching and her feet swollen. Luke hovered constantly, worried about her comfort, driving her slightly crazy with his attentiveness. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Grace told him after he'd tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. "Let me do things while I still can. I just want to take care of you." "You are. But let me take care of myself, too. I need to feel useful." Grace softened her tone. "I love you for worrying, but I'm strong, Luke. Trust that." The baby came in early November, 2 weeks before Dr. Brennan predicted. Grace's water broke in the middle of the night, and by dawn, the contractions were close enough that Luke rode like a man possessed to Timber Falls to fetch the doctor. Dr. Brennan arrived within hours, took one look at Grace laboring in their cabin, and calmly set about preparing for delivery. "First babies take their time," she told Luke, who was pacing like a caged animal. "Go chop wood or hunt or do something useful. You're making her nervous." Luke refused to leave entirely, instead sitting on the porch where he could hear but not hover. The sounds of Grace's labor, the moans, the cries, the determined breathing, nearly broke him. He'd been in battles, had faced death multiple times, but nothing had prepared him for the helpless terror of knowing the woman he loved was in pain and he could do nothing to stop it. Hours passed. Sunset came and went. Luke was seriously considering breaking down the door when he heard it, a new sound, high and reedy and furious. A baby's cry. Luke burst through the door to find Dr. Brennan holding a squalling infant, Grace propped up in bed looking exhausted and radiant. "Congratulations," the doctor said with a smile. "You have a daughter." Luke crossed to the bed in 3 strides, sinking down beside Grace. She held out the tiny bundle, and Luke took his daughter with shaking hands. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, eyes scrunched shut, fists waving in protest at this cold new world. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Hope," Grace whispered. "Hope Lily Mercer." "Hope Lily," Luke agreed, tears streaming down his face. "Welcome to the world, little one. We've been waiting for you." The baby quieted at the sound of his voice, her tiny hand grasping his finger with surprising strength. Luke looked at Grace, at the woman who'd saved him in more ways than he could count, at the daughter they'd created from love and hope and stubborn determination. His throat was too tight for words, but Grace understood. "We did it," she said softly. "We built our family." Dr. Brennan stayed overnight to monitor them both, sleeping in the corner while Luke kept a vigil beside his wife and daughter. By morning, Grace was nursing successfully, and the baby was pink and healthy and already displaying a temper that made Luke laugh. "She's going to be a fighter," he predicted. "She'll have to be, growing up in these mountains with us as parents." Grace smiled tiredly. "But she'll also know love and safety, and that the world can be good if you fight for it." Dr. Brennan left with promises to check on them in a week, and then the small family was alone. Luke and Grace settled into the exhausting, wonderful rhythm of new parenthood. Sleepless nights and diaper changes, nursing schedules and baby cries that meant different things. They took turns walking Hope when she was fussy, sang to her when she wouldn't sleep, marveled at every tiny change in her expressions. Winter closed in around them, but the cabin was warm and well stocked. Luke had spent the summer and fall preparing obsessively, laying in enough wood and food and supplies to last them months if necessary. They wouldn't be caught unprepared this time. They wouldn't repeat the mistakes that had cost his first family everything. Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly, just the three of them in their cabin, decorating a small pine tree Luke had cut and dragged home. Grace had made simple ornaments from scraps of cloth and ribbon. Luke carved a wooden angel for the top. They had no presents except each other and hope, but it felt like the richest celebration imaginable. "Last Christmas I was dying in a wagon," Grace said quietly as they sat by the fire, Hope sleeping in her cradle. "This Christmas I'm here with you and our daughter. How did my life change so completely in 1 year?" "Same way mine did. We found each other in a storm and decided to build something that could survive anything." Luke pulled her close. "Thank you, Grace, for giving me this, for giving me everything." Winter passed slowly but peacefully. Spring arrived with melting snow and budding trees and hope, growing from a tiny red-faced newborn into a chubby baby with Luke's blue eyes and Grace's determined chin. She learned to smile, to laugh, to grab at everything within reach. She was the light in their cabin, the proof that their love had created something permanent and good. Luke made his quarterly reports to Vickery's deputy without incident. The probation period was halfway complete, and Luke had been a model citizen, law-abiding, productive, exactly what the judge had required. The deputy seemed almost disappointed that there was nothing to report except quiet domesticity. That summer, Sheriff Vickery himself rode out to visit. He arrived in late July with supplies from town and news from the wider world. They sat on the porch while Hope napped inside and Grace prepared dinner, and Vickery told them about Carson Ridge, about the trial that people still talked about how Luke's case had led to a larger investigation of Army corruption that had uncovered 3 other officers engaged in similar schemes. "Your testimony opened doors," Vickery said. "Martinez and Winters both testified again at a formal inquiry. The Army had to admit there'd been problems in the command structure. Reforms were implemented. It won't bring back the soldiers who died because of stolen weapons, but it might save future lives." He looked at Luke seriously. "You did the right thing, Captain, even though it cost you years of your life, even though no one will officially thank you for it. You did right." "I just wanted to survive," Luke said quietly. "Everything else that came from it, the trial, the investigation, the reforms, those weren't my doing. Those were people finally listening to truth they'd been ignoring. Still, you started it by refusing to stay quiet." Vickery stood to leave, tipping his hat to Grace as she appeared with Hope on her hip. "You've built a good life here, Captain. You and your family. I'm glad the system gave you the chance to live it." After Vickery left, Luke and Grace sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Hope babbled happily in Grace's arms, grabbing at her mother's hair. Everything was quiet except for the evening birds and the creek running in the distance. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Grace asked. "If I'd made it to California instead of nearly dying in that blizzard? If you hadn't stopped when you heard me calling?" "Sometimes. But then I remember I wouldn't have you or Hope. I'd still be running, still punishing myself, still convinced I didn't deserve happiness." Luke took Hope from Grace's arms, holding his daughter close. "That blizzard was the best thing that ever happened to me. It brought me you. It brought us each other." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "And we made this. A home, a family, a life worth living." The years passed with surprising speed. Hope grew from a baby into a toddler, then a little girl with her mother's stubbornness and her father's quiet strength. Luke and Grace added 2 more children to their family, James, born 2 years after Hope, and Catherine, named for Grace's sister, who arrived 3 years after that. The cabin expanded to accommodate them, gaining a second room for the children, a larger kitchen, a root cellar for storage. Luke became known in the surrounding settlements as a skilled carpenter and an honest man. People would ride for miles to commission furniture or repairs, and Luke's work became respected throughout the territory. Grace took in sewing and taught Hope to read using books they ordered from back east. Their life was full of work and children and the constant challenges of mountain living, but it was also rich with love and purpose. They visited California once when Hope was 5, and Grace's sister Catherine begged to meet her niece and nephew. The journey took weeks, but it was worth it to see the sisters reunited, to watch Hope and James play with their cousins, to show Catherine that Grace had found happiness despite, or perhaps because of, all the hardships she'd endured. "You look good," Catherine told Grace one evening while the men were out and the children were asleep. "Happy, settled, not like the broken woman who wrote me that letter saying she was coming west." "That broken woman did come west. She just didn't make it all the way to you." Grace smiled. "But maybe that was how it was supposed to be. Maybe I needed to get lost in a blizzard to find what I was really looking for." Luke's probation ended after 2 years without incident. Judge Morrison sent a formal letter declaring Luke's obligations complete and his rights fully restored. Luke framed the letter and hung it in their cabin, not out of pride, but as a reminder that even broken systems could sometimes bend toward justice. On the 10-year anniversary of the night they'd met, Luke took Grace back to the spot where her wagon had been buried in snow. Nothing remained of it now. The weather and scavengers had long since claimed the wreckage, but they stood in the clearing and remembered. "I was so scared," Grace said quietly. "I'd given up, decided dying was easier than fighting. Then a very stubborn mountain man showed up and changed your mind." Luke wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Best night of my life, finding you, even though I didn't know it yet." "Best night of mine too, even though I nearly froze to death." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "Luke Mercer, what would you say to spending the next 10 years with me? And the 10 after that? And all the 10s that follow until we're old and gray?" "I'd say I already promised you that. In a courthouse in Carson Ridge, in front of God and everybody." Luke kissed her softly. "But I'll promise it again every day, if you need to hear it. I'm yours, Grace, for all the years we're given." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, following a trail they'd worn smooth over years of walking it. Smoke rose from the chimney where their children were probably tormenting each other under the watchful eye of a neighbor girl they'd hired to watch them for the evening. The setting sun painted everything gold, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, not threatening, just marking territory, claiming its place in the world. Grace paused at the edge of the clearing to look at their home. It had grown from that first desperate structure Luke had built to save her life into something much larger. Multiple rooms, a barn for the animals, a chicken coop, a garden that produced abundantly. But above the main door, weathered but still clear, their names remained carved in wood: Mercer and Holloway. "Should we change it?" Grace asked. "Now that I'm a Mercer too?" "No." Luke's voice was firm. "It reminds us where we started. Two people from different places meeting in a storm and choosing to build something together. That's still true, even if your last name changed. We're still building, Grace, every day." Inside, the cabin was warm and full of life. Hope was trying to teach James his letters, while Catherine pulled herself up on furniture and babbled happily. The children looked up when their parents entered, and Hope ran to throw her arms around Luke's legs. "Did you see where you met Mama? Did you find the magic wagon?" Hope's imagination had transformed the story of their meeting into something fairy tale-like, full of magic and destiny. "We found the place where the wagon was," Luke corrected gently, lifting his daughter into his arms. "And yes, it was magic, because it brought me your mother, and your mother brought me you." That night, after the children were asleep and the fire had burned low, Luke and Grace lay in bed and talked about their life. They discussed expanding the barn, about whether Hope was ready for more advanced books, about the letter that had come from California saying Catherine's eldest son wanted to visit next summer. "We should warn him about the work," Grace said drowsily. "City boy coming to the mountains, he'll be exhausted by noon the first day. He'll survive, we all do." Luke's hand found hers under the blankets. "Grace?" "Thank you. For saving me. For loving me. For giving me a life I never thought I'd deserve." Grace turned to face him in the darkness. "You saved me first. Don't forget that. I built you a cabin. You built me a life." Grace kissed him softly. "And I'd do it all again. The blizzard, the trial, the fear, everything, if it meant ending up right here." "Me too." Luke pulled her close, and they lay tangled together the way they had that first night in the wagon, two people who'd survived impossible odds and built something beautiful from the ruins. "Me too." Outside, the mountain wind howled across their roof the way it always did. But inside, they were warm and safe and home. The blizzard that had nearly killed them both had given them everything: a home, a family, and the proof that one act of compassion can rebuild two shattered worlds. Years later, when Hope was grown and married and Luke and Grace were grandparents watching a new generation play in the clearing where they'd first built their cabin, Grace would look at her husband and see not the broken fugitive who'd stumbled through a storm, but the man he'd become: father, husband, builder of homes and lives. And Luke would look at his wife and see not the dying widow in a frozen wagon, but the woman who'd had faith enough for both of them when his own had failed. The cabin would stand for generations, weathering storms and seasons and the slow passage of time. And above its door, carved in wood that refused to fade completely no matter how many years passed, two names would remain: Mercer and Holloway. A testament to the night a blizzard brought two broken people together, and they chose to build something that would outlast them both. That was their story. Not perfect, not easy, but real and hard-won, and theirs. A widow and a fugitive who met in a storm and created a home from nothing but hope and timber and the stubborn belief that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. They'd proven it true, one day at a time, one log at a time, one choice at a time. And when Luke Mercer died peacefully in his sleep at age 73, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the cabin he'd built with his own hands, his last words were for his wife of 44 years: "Thank you for giving me shelter when you didn't have to. You saved me first." Grace held his hand and whispered back, "And you built me a home. Fair trade, mountain man." The cabin still stands today, a landmark in those Colorado mountains. Visitors sometimes stop to look at the names carved above the door, weathered almost smooth but still visible if you know where to look. They don't know the full story, don't know about the trial or the blizzard or the desperate choices that led to this structure's existence. They just see an old cabin and wonder who Mercer and Holloway were. But the mountains remember, and sometimes, when the winter wind howls just right, you can almost hear it: the sound of an axe meeting timber, the promise being kept one strike at a time, the beginning of a love story that proved kindness and courage can survive anything, even death. That's how it ends. That's how it always ends for the lucky ones. Not with perfection, but with love. Not with ease, but with purpose. Not with running, but with standing still long enough to build something that lasts. The cabin beneath the blizzard became the home above the storm, and that made all the difference.